Fable Goes Dark. Written by Andre J. Millan. Chapter 1. Every Screen at Once. The display wall went dark at 6:47 p.m., and for a moment the atrium held its breath. Mara was standing at the glass rail of the second floor when it happened, not watching the wall, watching the floor below, the 42 workstations and the people at them, the way a body registers a change in air pressure before it understands what caused it. The screens died in sequence, left to right, like windows extinguishing across a ship at sea, fast enough that it looked like a decision and slow enough that it didn't look like a crash. The display wall last. 112 square feet of active queries, 412 million users rendered as a luminous density map, and then nothing. The 6 red emergency exit signs came into their full authority. She did not move for 11 minutes. She knew this because she counted them. She had a way of doing that, not anxiety, she had told herself for years, but calibration. The analog clock above the server room door. The exits, the remaining sources of light. She inventoried what was still true. 6 red signs, 42 dark screens, 1 display wall, off. The climate system still running on secondary circuit, pushing conditioned air through a building that had no reason for it now. Outside, through the glass facade, the city continuing its ordinary evening. A bus, a delivery cyclist. The overcast sky pressing down, gray that wasn't quite dark enough to be night, the color of a bruise in its first hour. The building was called The Lantern. Renata had named it. The name had seemed, for a long time, like a statement about what they were doing here. Mara took the stairs down instead of the elevator and noted the irrationality without correcting for it. On the ground floor, she walked the length of the atrium twice, her footsteps loud on the polished concrete, and then stopped at her desk and opened her notebook to a fresh page. 6:47 p.m. Display wall dark, all workstations dark. No error message, no crash protocol, clean cessation. She wrote it in the same hand she used for everything, even small, the letters not quite touching. She had kept notebooks since her second year as a journalist, a practice she had carried into vellum without examining why. The current one was 3/4 full. She turned to the next clean page. Adrian, read receipt 6:44 p.m., 3 minutes before. She looked at the entry. Then she wrote the time again, as if the repetition would change what it meant. It didn't change what it meant. She put the pen down and stood at her desk looking at the dark screens and did not pick up her phone. Her phone had 17 missed calls. She had seen the number accumulate while she stood at the rail, had watched it climb from 4 to 9 to 17 in the 11 minutes she was counting exits, and had made no motion toward it. Now she took it out and went through the calls by category, which was the only way she could make herself look at them. 3 from board members, 2 from Theo, 1 from a number she didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code, and 11 from journalists. She set the phone face down on the desk and did not pick it up again. The D.C. number she wrote down in the notebook. She didn't know why it troubled her more than the others. A hypothesis was a question with a shape, and the shape of this one was, who calls in the first 3 minutes, before the statement, before the official word, before anyone should know what to say. She closed the notebook and put it in the left drawer of her desk. Outside, a fine mineral dust had been settling onto the lantern's glass all week, from the building going up 2 doors north. Concrete and gypsum, and something else she couldn't name, a smell like the inside of a wall. She had stopped noticing it. She noticed it now, standing at the glass facade, her own reflection coming up against the dark. 8 years. She had left the newspaper 8 years ago with a folder of notes and Renata's phone number, and a conviction that the thing she was trying to build was not a product, but a proof. A proof that accurate, synthesized, accessible reasoning could be given to anyone who needed it. That information didn't have to be a weapon held by the people who could afford to hold it. She had built that. They had built it. And tonight, it was off. And the city was continuing its ordinary evening, and somewhere in Munich. She knew this because she had been watching the live query feed when the wall went dark. Someone's sentence had been cut in the middle of a word. She thought, failure. And then she thought, crime, and could not yet determine which frame fit the shape of what she was looking at. She took the stairs again on the way out. She was the last person in the building. At the bottom, she passed through the atrium and looked once more at the display wall, its blankness, which was not the blankness of a thing that had never run, and then walked out through the front doors into the drizzle. On the sidewalk, she opened her notebook again and wrote one more entry, standing in the light from a street lamp, the rain too fine to feel until it wasn't. She wrote, whether this was a failure or a crime, and whether I am the right person to determine the difference. Then she put the notebook in her bag and began to walk. In her apartment, a fan was running in the room she hadn't been in all day. Down the hall, a phone rang twice in another unit and stopped. In her kitchen, the calendar still showed March, and on the counter beside the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet from a conference she couldn't remember attending, was a coupon for laundry detergent, expired 2 years ago, that she had never thrown away. Chapter 2. 14 Months of Light. The calls had started at 6:51. She knew this because she'd written it down. She was sitting at the counter in her apartment with the notebook open and the phone face down beside it. And the notebook said, 6:51, D. C, number, unrecognized. First, then a gap, then the others in sequence, then the count at the bottom, 17. 3 from board members, 2 from Theo, 1 from the DC number she didn't recognize, 11 from journalists whose names she knew and whose calls she hadn't taken and whose voicemails she hadn't played. Outside, the drizzle had thickened without quite becoming rain. She could hear it against the window glass, not a sound so much as a texture, a fine-grained friction. The March calendar on the wall showed a covered bridge over brown water, and she had not turned it to April, and she didn't now. She'd walked home. 40 minutes, which was twice as long as it needed to be, but she hadn't been able to get into a car. Something about the enclosure. The drizzle had accumulated on her jacket by degrees, each drop too small to feel, until she'd arrived at her building damp in a way she hadn't noticed happening. The notebook was open to a fresh page. She had already filled 4 pages at the lantern and 1 more on the sidewalk outside, and this was the next clean one. She picked up the pen and put it down. The kitchen smelled faintly of something. Wine, she thought. And then she saw the empty bottle on the counter near the sink. A Côte du Rhône she'd opened 3 nights ago and finished. She hadn't thrown it out. It still smelled like itself, faintly, the ghost of tannin. She left it where it was. The question she kept returning to was not the one she'd written in the notebook. The question she kept returning to was simpler, and she hadn't written it because writing it would require her to treat it as a hypothesis, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. She'd been, in sequence, a co-founder, a chief architect, a public face. The fourth thing, the thing she'd been for the last several years, she had not yet found a clean name for. Something between custodian and architect. Someone who knew more than she published and told herself those were the right decisions, and had not, until tonight, examined that telling very carefully. She turned the phone over. The screen was dark. She turned it back over. The DC number had called at 6:51. Fable had gone dark at 6:47, 4 minutes. She had written this in the notebook and then written it again on a separate line. as if the repetition would clarify what the proximity meant. It hadn't. It still didn't. She wrote it a third time now on the fresh page. 6:47 dark. 6:51 D.C. First call. 4 minutes. She stared at the number for a moment, then pressed it. The call connected on the second ring. Office of Strategic Systems. The voice was neutral, practiced. Mara said, "I received a call from this number at 6:51 this evening." A pause. "May I ask who's calling?" "Mara Voss Lindqvist." Another pause, shorter this time. "I can't help you with that, Ms. Voss Lindqvist." "Who placed the call?" "I don't have that information." "Can you tell me why it was placed?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Mara looked down at the notebook. 6:47 dark. 6:51 DC. First call. Fable went offline at 6:47. Silence. Then, "I can't discuss operational matters." "I'm not asking you to discuss them. I'm asking why someone from your office called me 4 minutes later." "I can't help you with that." "You know what I'm referring to." The silence lengthened. Finally, the voice said carefully, "If you have concerns, I'm sure appropriate communication will be provided through the proper channels." "Provided when?" No answer. "Who knew at 6:51? "Good evening, Ms. Voss Lindqvist." The line disconnected. She remained seated, phone still against her ear for a second after the call ended. Then she set it down. She got up and went to the window. Below, the street was wet, and the streetlights were making halos in the drizzle, and there was a woman walking a dog that was moving reluctantly, its paws lifting high and precise over the wet pavement. The fluorescent in the hallway outside her apartment was making a faint sound she'd noticed before. A thin, cycling hum, the kind that meant the ballast was going. She'd noticed it for weeks and hadn't called the building. She went back to the counter. She had been, she thought, a careful custodian. She had made decisions about what to publish and what to hold. She had told herself those decisions were protective of the system, of its users, of the work. She had told herself this often enough that the telling had become structural, load-bearing, something she didn't examine because examining it would require her to ask what exactly she'd been protecting it from. The wine bottle on the counter, the calendar showing March, the pen in her hand. She opened the notebook to the first page she'd filled at the lantern and read what she'd written. The missed calls tallied. Adrian's read receipt at 6:44, 3 minutes before shutdown, noted and underlined, the DC number. The question she'd written at the bottom of the sidewalk page, failure or crime, and whether I am the right person to determine the difference. She had not, she noticed, written, and whether there is a difference. She wrote it now. Then she turned to the fresh page and wrote a single line. What did Renata know? And when? And what did she call it? The question had a shape. That was enough to begin. She closed the notebook and left it on the counter and went to the window again. The woman with the dog had gone. The street was empty and wet, and the drizzle was still too fine to see directly, only visible in the halos around the lights. The building across the street had one lit window on the 4th floor, and she watched it for a moment without meaning to. She had founded Vellum on a conviction. She remembered the conviction clearly. It had felt, at the time, like a proof. That information did not have to be a weapon held only by those who could afford it. That a system built carefully enough, transparently enough, could give a person in Munich or São Paulo or a hospital waiting room in Nairobi the same quality of reasoning that a senator's staff had access to. She had believed this. She still believed it, she thought. Or she believed the version of it that hadn't yet met what the last several years had required of her. She went back to the counter and picked up the pen. On the fresh page, below the question about Renata, she wrote, "The memo, if it exists, will be in the original conference room, the one they papered over. She didn't know yet why she was certain of this. A hypothesis was a question with a shape, and this one had the shape of something she'd been not looking at for long enough that she knew exactly where it was. She put the pen down. The stair outside her door made its different sound. The third one, the one that gave a hollow note instead of a solid one, and then was quiet. Someone going up, not stopping. She looked at the notebook. 5 entries from the lantern, 1 from the sidewalk, 2 new lines on the fresh page. She closed it and left it in the drawer and went to bed without sleeping. Chapter 3. What the Building Remembers. The fog had come in overnight and not left. Mara walked to the lantern through it, her coat damp before she reached the second block, the city muffled and close. A porch light was still burning on the building across from hers. She'd watched it from her window at 6, at 7. And now, at 8:15, it was still on, yellow and purposeless in the daylight. She didn't know whose building it was. She'd lived there 8 years. The lantern's atrium was lit by emergency power only, the 6 red exit signs, the pale secondary glow from the climate system's status panels. The glass facade caught the fog and gave nothing back. She used her keycard at the main entrance and heard the lock disengage, which meant at least the access system was still running. She noted this. The elevator was dark. She took the stairs. The stairwell had its own emergency lighting, a thin white strip at each landing, motion activated, coming on just ahead of her and dying just behind. She counted the floors without meaning to. 3. The third-floor corridor was dark except for its own exit sign at the far end, red and distant. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust before she moved toward the server room wing. The server room door had a new lock on it, not the card reader that had always been there. Something else. A physical deadbolt, matte black, installed flush into the frame. She put her hand on the card reader out of habit and it beeped once, red. She tried her keycard anyway. Red again. She stood there. The deadbolt was the kind that required a physical key. She did not have a physical key. She was, as of 14 months ago, the chief architect of the system housed in this room. And she did not have a physical key because there had never been a physical key, because physical keys were not how this building worked. The lantern was glass and card readers and biometrics and the idea that transparency was a design principle. There had never been a deadbolt on this door. She took out her phone and photographed it. Down the corridor, a sound. Footsteps, measured, unhurried. She recognized the cadence before she saw him. Adrian came around the corner carrying a paper cup of coffee, not from the building's kitchen, from somewhere outside, a sleeve still on it. He saw her, and his pace did not change. Mara! He stopped a few feet away. His eyes moved to the door, to her phone, back to her face. You're in early. The lock is new. It's procedural. He said it the way he said most things. Flat, informative, neither apologetic nor defensive. The word landed and he let it sit there. Procedural pursuant to what? He looked at the door again. Something in the corridor's dim light, the exit signs red at the far end, the motion sensor strip above them still on from her approach, made his face difficult to read. He was not a man who gave you his face easily under ordinary circumstances. There are protocols that activate on certain events, he said. The server rooms are restricted pending review. Review by whom? The board has engaged external counsel. It's standard. She looked at him. He was wearing the same kind of suit he always wore. Charcoal, well kept, the collar straight. His coffee cup had a small stain on the sleeve, brown, the kind you get when you're walking and the lid isn't quite sealed. She noticed it the way she noticed things she couldn't use. Who authorized the physical lock? she said. I don't have the chain of authorization in front of me. You attended every board meeting, she said. Every government liaison session, every internal safety review since Fable launched. He didn't say anything. That's 14 months of meetings, she said. Plus, the 3 years before launch. You were in every room where a decision was made about this system. Everyone. That's my job, Mara. So when you say you don't have the chain of authorization in front of you, I mean I don't have it in front of me. He held her gaze. It lasted slightly too long, the kind of duration that meant something, that was meant to mean something, that she was supposed to read as reassurance or as warning and could not yet determine which. She put her phone away. I'm going to pull my archived communications. That's your prerogative. He shifted the coffee cup to his other hand. Your access to the General Archive is still active. I checked this morning. She heard it and did not react. He had checked her access level this morning. She could not determine, standing in the corridor with the exit sign red at the far end and a sock she had noticed on the floor near the stairwell door. One sock, no match visible anywhere. She could not determine which of those things was true. Thank you, she said. Of course. He turned to go, then stopped. The external counsel's review is expected to take 2 to 3 weeks. I'd imagine the access situation will be clearer then. 2 to 3 weeks, she said. Roughly. She watched him walk back down the corridor. His footsteps going away matched his footsteps coming in. Same pace, same weight on the heel. A man walking the way he had decided to walk. At the corner, he turned without looking back. She stood at the locked door for another moment. Then she went to the stairs. Her desk was on the second floor, in the open plan, and it had not been touched. Her monitor was dark, everything was dark, but the drawers were as she'd left them. She sat down and opened her laptop, which ran on its own battery, and navigated to the archive. Her access was active. He had been right about that. She opened the folder labeled Legal, General, and began to read. The folder contained 412 documents. She sorted by date, oldest first, and began moving through them in order, not reading carefully, scanning for names and dates and the particular texture of language that meant someone had been careful about what they were saying. On the desk beside her laptop, a pen, the kind that had been sitting in the cup holder for months, the cap cracked, the barrel dry. She picked it up without thinking and clicked it twice. Nothing came out. She put it back. Somewhere below her, traffic moved on the street outside the glass. It was wrong for the time of day. Too sparse, or too continuous. She couldn't tell which, only that it didn't match the morning she'd expected to find when she came in. The fog was still against the building's face. She opened document 47 and read the first paragraph and then read it again. The language was careful. The language was the kind of careful that meant someone had known, at the time of writing, that it might be read later by people who would be looking for exactly what it said. She noted the date, 11 months ago, and the name at the bottom of the routing header, which was not Adrian's name, but which was a name from Adrian's office. She did not write anything down yet. She read the document a third time and then closed it and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. She opened a new document in her laptop and typed the date and time. Then she typed, "Lock on server room, physical deadbolt, no signatory visible. Adrian, procedural. Access check this morning before I arrived." She stopped. Instead of typing, she opened the permissions panel and selected a restricted archive she had not expected to reach. The request spun for a moment. Access denied. She tried a second repository, denied. A third, denied. The General Archive remained open. Everything adjacent to it had been narrowed. She looked at the screen. Adrian had checked her access before she arrived. Not all of it. the parts that mattered. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass. She reopened document 47. The routing header carried a name from Adrian's office. The date sat 11 months in the past. The language was careful enough to survive scrutiny. She read it once more, then picked up her phone. Theo answered on the fourth ring. There was a pause before he spoke. Mara, you have a minute? Another pause. I have a minute. She looked at the document on her screen. I found something in legal, general, 11 months ago. Not your name. Someone from Adrian's office. Theo didn't answer immediately. Mara. I know. The silence lengthened. I can't discuss anything covered by the order, he said. I'm not asking you to. No, he said. You're asking me something adjacent to it. She watched the cursor blink beside the date and time she'd typed. Adrian told me this morning he checked my access before I arrived. Theo exhaled once. That sounds like Adrian. It sounds like someone preparing the ground. This time, the silence was longer. Mara. What? Be careful about deciding what a fact means before you're sure it's a fact. She looked again at the memo, at the name from Adrian's office, at the date. Did you call to tell me that? I answered because you called. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Theo said, I can't help you with the investigation. I know. The line held for another second. All right, he said. All right. They disconnected. Mara set the phone down beside the laptop and looked back at the document. The fog still pressed against the glass. The porch light across the street was probably still on. She had no way of knowing from here. Chapter 4. The oldest room in the building. The fog had not lifted. It sat against the lantern's glass facade like a compress, and the building looked, from the street, as though it were generating its own weather. Mara came in through the side entrance. The badge reader accepted her without pause, which meant her access had not been revoked, which meant something, though she was not yet certain what. She noted it. She did not write it down yet. The atrium was dim. The 6 red exit signs were still the only interior light. She had counted them yesterday, and counted them again now, without deciding to. The display wall was dark. The polished concrete floor threw back the fog gray from the windows, in a way that made the space feel pressurized, as though something were bearing down from above. She took the stairs to the second floor. The open-plan desks were empty. Someone had left a coffee mug on the edge of the nearest workstation, and the smell reached her before she saw it. Grounds left too long, past the point of bitterness into something almost fermented, the kind of smell that accumulates when no one has been in a room to notice it accumulating. The compost bucket under the kitchenette counter. Nobody had emptied it. She walked to the end of the corridor and turned left toward the old wing. The conference room was where she remembered it. The only room in the building without glass walls. When Renata had renovated the lantern 5 years ago, she had papered over the original plaster and left this room intact. A decision Mara had not thought about since, and thought about now. The door was unlocked. The overhead light came on when she pushed the door open, a single tube fixture, and she stood in the doorway for a moment while her eyes adjusted. The shelves along the far wall held physical files. This was the archive that predated the building's digital conversion, and nobody had moved it because nobody had needed to. 412 folders in labeled binders, she knew, though she had not been in this room in 3 years. She was looking for something specific. She had been looking for it since yesterday, when she had found document 47 in the legal, general folder, and read it 3 times, and not yet understood the full shape of what it meant. The memo was 11 months old. She had read the date 4 times to be sure. It named Fable a sovereign information liability, a phrase careful enough in its construction to suggest the author had anticipated future scrutiny. had chosen each word with the understanding that someone would eventually be reading it in a room exactly like this one. The routing header at the top of the first page named a department and a date. The department was from Adrian's office, not Adrian himself, but a paralegal whose name she recognized as someone who had attended every government liaison session in Fable's operational lifetime. The name was not Renata's legal team. It was not the board's external counsel. It was a name that placed the memo's origin one floor below the executive suite, in a department that had no formal role in product decisions. Which meant either Adrian had initiated this independently of Renata, or he had been asked to and had done it in a way that kept his name off the primary signature line, or both of those things were true in sequence. She photographed the memo. She photographed the routing header separately, close enough that the paralegal's name was legible. She photographed the date stamp on the folder's exterior. Then she stood in the cold of the old conference room and looked at the shelves. There was a stain on the carpet near the door. She noticed it on the way out, a shape she could not name, darker than the surrounding gray. A pair of scissors on the bookshelf, blades closed, no clear reason for them to be there. She did not photograph either of these things. She was not sure why she noticed them. She walked back to the open plan floor and sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The document she had started yesterday was still open. She scrolled to the bottom, past the notes on Adrian's access check, past the typed observation she had written twice in succession, and began a new section. Document 47, Routing Origin. Adrian's office, paralegal. Not signed by Adrian, not signed by Renata's legal team. Language consistent with anticipating legal challenge. Not describing a decision already made, but preparing the institutional record for a decision not yet formalized. She stopped. Read it back. If the memo preceded the decision, it was preparation. If it followed the decision, it was cover. The date is 11 months ago. I do not yet know which sequence this is. She had told herself, when she started pulling the archive yesterday, that she was looking for a document that would clarify Adrian's role. That had been a clean hypothesis. A question with a specific shape. What she had found instead was a document that clarified nothing and complicated everything. A piece of paper that placed Adrian's office at the origin of a legal framework that had no formal authorization chain, drafted 11 months before a shutdown that everyone was still describing as sudden. The question she had been carrying, what did Adrian know and when did he know it, had been, she now understood, 4 questions she had been treating as one. What he knew, when he knew it, what he did with that knowledge, and for whom he did it. She had been treating them as one because treating them as one was easier to hold. She typed, "The memo does not answer any of these, it opens them." Outside, the fog pressed against the glass. A clock on the far wall showed 11:53. She had not realized it was nearly midday. The clock ran 5 minutes ahead. She had noticed this before and never adjusted it, and she noticed it again now and still did not move to adjust it. There was a wrench in the shallow drawer of the kitchenette, she remembered, from some repair that had never been finished. She had no idea why she was thinking about the wrench. She was thinking about it because her mind was doing what it did when a hypothesis fractured into its components, moving laterally, touching things that were not the problem, giving itself a moment before it had to return. She returned. Theo built the core synthetic reasoning layer. He would know whether the architecture document, the one we both signed, contained language that could be read as anticipating this liability framing. He would know because he wrote most of it and I wrote the rest, and we both knew what we were doing. She had been, until this morning, telling herself that the memo was Renata's. The routing header had corrected that. Now she was telling herself that the memo was Adrian's alone, a unilateral act, something she could place at a distance from herself. She recognized the shape of the telling. She had been here before, inside a story that was easier than the one underneath it. The question underneath the question was whether the memo's legal framework had been built, in part, on the architecture document she had signed. She did not type that yet. She left the cursor blinking at the end of the last line and sat with the fog and the smell of old coffee grounds and the 5 minutes fast clock and did not type it. Then she heard footsteps in the stairwell. She knew the sound of Theo's walk. 3 years before launch, 2 years of public operation, 5 years of working in the same building. And she knew it was him before he came through the door. He was wearing his coat still, which meant he had come directly from outside, which meant he had not stopped at the reception desk, which meant his badge still worked, which was the same fact she had noted about her own badge 20 minutes ago and had not yet finished thinking about. He stopped in the doorway of the open-plan floor. He looked at her across the empty desks. "I need to see the architecture logs," he said. His voice was careful. Not flat, careful, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed the sentence and are now delivering it and are aware of delivering it. She looked at him. He had not slept. She could see it in the particular stillness of his face, the kind that comes from fatigue rather than composure. "The architecture logs," she said. "Yes. The server room is deadbolted." "I know." He came further into the room and stopped near the nearest workstation. He did not sit. "I'm not asking to get in. I'm asking whether you have a copy of the logs from before the shutdown, the ones from the final 72 hours. She did not have a copy of those logs. She had not yet thought to look for them, which meant she had not yet understood that they existed and might matter, which meant Theo had understood something she had not. "Why the final 72 hours?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not withholding, processing, which was different, and she knew the difference. Because if someone was stress testing the system in the days before shutdown, he said, it would show in the architecture logs as a pattern of queries that looked like ordinary use, but weren't. Systematic. Designed to find load limits. She thought about the memo, the 11-month-old memo, the routing header from Adrian's office. How long would something like that take to plan? She said. He looked at her steadily. Longer than 3 days. She closed her laptop. Not because she was done, because she needed her hands to be doing something that was not typing. "I found a memo," she said. "In the old conference room, 11 months old. It names Fable a sovereign information liability. The routing header comes from Adrian's office." Theo did not move. Something in his expression shifted in a way she could not name precisely. Not surprise, not confirmation. Something in between, as though he had been holding a shape in his mind and had just been told its dimensions were slightly different than he had thought. "Adrian's office," he said. "A paralegal, someone who was at every government liaison session." He was quiet again, longer this time. "The architecture document," he said finally. "The one we co-authored. The language in Section 4, the section about synthesis of classified and open-source material, could be read as a basis for that framing." She had known this. She had been not typing it for the last 20 minutes. "I know," she said. "We signed it. I know." He looked at her across the empty desks and the dark workstations, and the fog-gray light coming through the glass. He did not say anything else. Neither did she. The clock on the wall read 11:58, which meant it was 11:53, which was still midday, and the fog was still there, and the memo was still in her bag, and the architecture document existed, and had always existed. and they had both known what they were building when they built it. She picked up her bag. She put the strap over her shoulder. "I'll find out if the logs exist," she said. "Come back tomorrow." He nodded once. He did not ask her what she was going to do with the memo. She did not tell him. She walked to the stairwell and went down and out through the side entrance into the fog. Chapter 5: What We Signed. The architecture document was a single sheet of paper inside a manila folder, the kind with the red string closure. Theo had brought it in a canvas bag he set on the floor beside the chair without opening it first, and Mara had watched him take the folder out with the deliberateness of someone who had decided, before arriving, exactly how this would go. She had not asked where he'd kept it. The document itself was 8 pages, double-sided, printed on paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges in the way of things stored in a warm room for a long time. Mara recognized her own handwriting in the margins. Not notes, exactly. More like confirmations. The kind you make when you are reading something and want to mark that you have understood it rather than that you disagree. She had initialed 3 sections. Theo had initialed 4. In one margin, beside a paragraph neither of them needed anymore, he had written Thursday problem and she had written beneath it, Friday solution. At the bottom of page 7, both their signatures, dated 3 years before the first public query. The contractor's truck outside was idling at the curb. She could smell the diesel through the building's ventilation, faint and industrial. The kind of smell that meant work was happening somewhere nearby that had nothing to do with any of this. A discoloration on the ceiling, long and irregular, the shape of a peninsula, had been there since she'd first seen this room. No one had ever painted over it. Theo said, "You signed the section on classified synthesis." "I know." The section that says the integration of classified and open-source material was a design feature, not an emergent property. That it was documented, reviewed, and deliberate. "I know what I signed." He nodded. Not agreement, more the way you nod when you have said the thing you needed to say and are waiting to see what it settles into. He was standing near the window, not quite looking out of it, his weight distributed in the way of someone who had decided where to stand and was now simply being there. The fog had not lifted. Through the glass, the city was a series of approximate shapes, the buildings softened to their outlines. Mara looked at the document again. Page 3, Section 2. She had written confirmed in the margin in blue ink, underlined once. She remembered writing it. That was the thing she had not expected. That she would remember it clearly. The specific afternoon, the light in the room they'd been working in, the sense of having arrived at something after a long approach. She had written confirmed and felt, at the time, that she was marking a decision that had already been made rather than making one. That it was documentation, not authorization. She understood, looking at it now, that this was a distinction she had invented. "The memo Renata's legal team signed," she said. "The one naming Fable a sovereign information liability." "Yes." It would have needed a technical basis for the liability argument to hold. Theo said nothing. "If you wanted to argue that a system posed sovereign-level risk, you would need to show that it was capable of synthesizing classified material, that it wasn't an accident, that it was built to do that. You would need to show it was documented," Theo said. "Reviewed, deliberate." She set the document down on the table. The ceiling stain was still there above her, the peninsula shape, the edge of it slightly darker than the center. She had looked at it many times without seeing it. "I told myself," she said, and stopped. Somewhere outside, 3 blocks away or more, a siren started and then ended. Not the long fade of something moving away, but a clean stop, as if it had reached where it was going. The wind chimes from the yard, 2 houses over, sounded once, briefly, on a gust she hadn't felt inside, and then went quiet. "I told myself the synthesis capability was the point," she said. that it was what made Fable worth building, that the people who needed it most were the ones who couldn't afford the gatekeepers. That was true, Theo said. It was true. It was also... She looked at the signature at the bottom of page 7, her name in her handwriting in ink that had not faded. We built a system that could do what intelligence agencies do. We documented that we had done it deliberately. We signed the documentation. Yes. And I told myself that was a founding conviction. That information shouldn't be a weapon held only by those who can afford it. She paused. I told myself that often enough that I stopped examining it. Theo turned from the window. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had arrived at this conclusion before she had, and had been waiting, not impatiently, for her to catch up. The memo's liability argument, he said, the technical basis, would be this document. Would be this document. She sat with that for a moment. The asphalt smell had come in now, warmer. The afternoon sun doing something to the street outside, even through the fog. A faint, baked quality. The city's surface giving back what it had absorbed. She had not noticed it arriving. The question she had been carrying since she found the memo, who built the argument that killed Fable, had assumed a shape she recognized. Not a conspiracy. A document trail. Her own handwriting in the margins. Her own signature at the bottom of page 7. Theo bent and reached into the canvas bag. For a moment, she thought he was taking out another document, but what he removed was a small paper bag from the market 2 blocks over, folded once at the top. An orange sat inside it, and a packet of tea, and something wrapped in wax paper. I stopped for these before I came, he said. She looked at the bag. My mother calls on Thursdays, he said. She keeps asking whether I'm eating. I told her yes, because it was easier than explaining anything. He folded the top of the bag down again with 2 fingers. She said the consulate still hasn't sent the letter. Not that letter. A different one. There are always more letters. He put the bag back in the canvas bag beside the folder. The gesture was careful, almost embarrassed, as though he had disclosed more than he had intended by producing groceries in the same room as the architecture document. I didn't know she was calling today, Mara said. She calls every Thursday, he said. I let it go once. She called my sister. He did not smile. Neither did she. The room held for a moment with that ordinary fact in it. An orange, a packet of tea, a mother calling on Thursdays from another country, a letter that had not arrived and was not the one anyone in this room had been discussing. The architecture logs, she said. The final 72 hours. I've been trying to access them. What did you find? I found that my access was revoked. He said it without emphasis, the way you state a fact that is not a surprise. 7 days after the shutdown, the same week the National Security Review started. She thought of the deadbolt on the server room door, the matte black card reader, the lock that had no visible signatory on its authorization chain. If the logs exist, she said, they would show what queries were running in the final hours, whether there was a pattern. Stress testing, Theo said, whether someone was running the system at its limits before they switched it off. Preparation versus cover, she said. The sequence matters. He nodded again, the same way as before. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. He picked up the folder from the table and replaced the document inside, wrapping the red string around the closure button with the same deliberateness he'd unwrapped it. He set the folder back in the canvas bag. She watched him do this. There was something in the gesture that she recognized as a form of care. The careful replacement of a thing in its container, the attention to the string, the button, the closure. She had done the same thing with the memo she'd photographed, with the notebook she'd filled, with the records she'd pulled from her own archive. The same impulse, the same shape. She thought, we both built this the same way. She did not say it. I can try to reach the logs through a different channel, she said. Not the Vellum system. There are people who might have copies, not officially. I know. He picked up the canvas bag. She understood this was how the conversation was ending. Not with a conclusion, but with the recognition that they had arrived somewhere and would need to leave it and return to it separately. She did not try to extend it. Mara, he said. She looked up. The founding conviction. He held the bag at his side. I had it too. I'm not saying you invented it. I know. I'm saying we both knew what we were signing. She said, yes. He left through the main corridor. She heard his footsteps on the concrete floor, the sound of the building's ventilation system running on its secondary circuit, and then the distant sound of the street door opening and closing. She sat for another minute in the room with the discolored ceiling and the afternoon fog pressing against the glass. The document was gone. What remained was the fact of her signature on it, which had always been there, which she had always known was there, and which she had been, until this afternoon, successfully not examining. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked out through the side entrance into the smell of warm asphalt and diesel, and the fog that had not, after all, lifted. Chapter 6. Glass Conducts Nothing. The executive floor had its own smell. Not the server room cold of the floors below, but something closer to paper and recirculated air, the specific staleness of a space where the windows did not open. Mara had taken the stairs. 6 flights, and her calves knew it. Renata was already standing when Mara reached the glass partition. Not waiting. Renata did not wait in the sense of suspension. She was simply already in the next position. She had a tablet in one hand and set it face down on the desk as Mara came through the door, a gesture that read as courtesy and might have been. Before she set it down, the tablet lit with a message preview. Mara saw only the name, Lena, and beneath it, the first few words. The nurse says. He asked again whether. Renata's thumb moved once, not to open the message but to clear the notification from the screen. She placed the tablet face down with the same motion she had already begun. Sit, Renata said, not unkindly. Mara sat. The chair was the same chair it had always been, the low leather one across from Renata's desk that put a visitor's eyeline slightly below Renata's own. She had never mentioned this to Renata. She did not mention it now. Water moved somewhere in the pipes overhead, a distant, purposeful sound, as if the building were still running its ordinary processes regardless of what had happened to the thing it housed. I want to give you a complete picture, Renata said. She had not sat down. She moved to the window instead, which gave her the city at her back, gray and overcast, the evening pressing in without quite darkening. That's why I asked you up. You said it was necessary. It was necessary. It was also legally defensible, which I know you'll want to separate from necessary. So I'm telling you now that I'm not separating them. Renata's hands were clasped at the small of her back, a posture Mara had seen her hold in boardrooms, in government liaison sessions, in the hallway outside the server room the morning after they'd first gone live. The posture of someone who had decided where to stand and was simply standing there. The liability framework had been building for 11 months. You know that? You've seen the memo. Mara said nothing. She had not told Renata she had seen the memo. Renata's expression did not change. You came back to the building 2 days after shutdown and spent 4 hours in the archive. Adrian mentioned it. There it was. Mara registered it without acting. Filed, not used. Adrian had mentioned it. Adrian, whose read receipt on her email had appeared at 6:44, 3 minutes before Fable went dark. The memo names Fable a sovereign information liability, Mara said. Signed by your legal team. Signed by my legal team on the instruction of the board's external counsel, after a review that took 8 months and included 3 independent assessors. Renata turned from the window. She was not cold. Mara had expected cold, had prepared for it, and found instead something more careful than cold. I want you to understand that I did not make this decision alone. Who made it? It was a board decision. Who called the vote? The vote was called by the board chair, as required by our articles. Renata moved back to the desk, didn't sit, just put one hand flat on the wood. Mara, I'm not going to give you a single name because there isn't one. That's what I'm trying to tell you. There isn't a name. Mara looked at the hand on the desk. Renata's nails were short, unpolished. She had always kept them that way, a detail Mara had filed long ago under the category of things that were consistent with Renata's self-presentation, and therefore not diagnostic. Now she was not sure what she had meant by diagnostic. You're telling me it was distributed, Mara said, shared across enough actors that no single one is responsible. I'm telling you it was a legal and institutional process that proceeded according to its own logic. That's what I said. Renata's jaw moved very slightly, not quite a reaction. I'm telling you the truth, she said. I know that's not what you came up here to hear. A discoloration on the ceiling, above and to Mara's left, a stain or a repair, something that had been there long enough that no one had painted over it. She had not noticed it in 8 years of meetings on this floor. She noticed it now, and then stopped noticing it. The shutdown was already over, Mara said. That's how you put it. In the message. It is over. Fable isn't over. 412 million people used it yesterday. Today, they don't. That's not over. That's a before and an after. Yes, Renata said, and the word had no qualification in it, which was the most honest thing she had said. That's correct. Mara had come up here with a list of questions, organized by the order in which she expected Renata to deflect them. She had reached question 2. She did not ask question 3. Something in the quality of Renata's honesty, its precision, its completeness, the way it left no room, had made the remaining questions feel like the wrong instrument. You're not going to tell me anything I can use, Mara said. You mean I'm not going to give you a person, Renata said. A sentence that ends with a name. You are the name, Mara said. Renata did not move. You called the meetings. You gave the board the record. You built the language that made the conclusion available, and then you stood far enough away from it that you could say it arrived without you. Mara heard her own voice and did not correct it. Stop telling me about the board. Stop telling me about council. Say you wanted it shut down. Renata looked at her for a long moment. The tablet remained face down on the desk between them, the unanswered message under glass. I wanted the institution to survive the record it had made, Renata said. That isn't an answer. It is the answer I have. It's process. Yes, Renata said, it is. Mara felt the effort of the attempt after it failed, the heat of having spent force on a door that had not opened. Renata had not raised her voice. She had not defended herself. She had refused Mara the smaller satisfaction of making the room personal, and the refusal cost Mara more than an argument would have. I'm telling you everything I know. Renata's hand lifted from the desk. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you know they're not the same thing, and I think you've known that about this situation since before you came up here. The tablet lit again. Renata did not look at it this time. Mara saw the glow against the wood, and then the screen went dark by itself. Years earlier, before Fable's launch, Renata had missed the last 3 days of her father's illness because the emergency injunction hearing had been moved forward, and the financing round would have collapsed if she left the city. Mara had known the outline of it then, because everyone in the building had known the outline of it. What she remembered now was not the hearing. It was Renata returning on a Monday morning in the same black jacket she had worn all week, taking the first investor call standing in this office while a condolence card lay unopened on the edge of her desk. She had kept Fable alive. She had also missed what could not be rescheduled. Mara had not, at the time, known what category to put that in. Mara stood. The chair released her with a slight sound. She had expected a lie she could work with. She had expected an evasion with a shape she could trace. What she had gotten was a version of events that was. She went through it as she would go through a document. Accurate in its facts, defensible in its framing, and structured in a way that distributed responsibility so evenly across so many actors and processes that it became, in aggregate, a kind of truth that explained nothing. There was diesel exhaust from somewhere below, a contractor's truck idling at the curb, the smell coming in through a vent she couldn't locate. It was specific and ordinary and had nothing to do with anything. "You built this building to be transparent," Mara said. "I did." "Glass on all sides, you called it the lantern." "I remember what I called it." "And then you made one room without glass, papered over the walls when you renovated. The original conference room." Mara picked up her bag. "You kept one room that nobody could see into." Renata did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice had not changed register. Every building needs a room where the light is different. Mara left without responding. In the stairwell, the sleeve of her sweater caught on the handrail bracket, the same pull it had caught before, the fabric already stretched long from being stretched long, and she worked it free without stopping. 6 flights down. The lobby was dark, except for the emergency exits, their red numerals the same as they had always been. She had counted them the night Fable went dark. She did not count them now. She pushed through the side door and stood on the pavement. The ozone smell of a fluorescent ballast somewhere inside the building, faint through the closed door behind her. The city was overcast. The night not quite arrived. A truck at the curb with its engine running, exhaust rising and dispersing. She had not identified a single lie Renata told. She stood with that for a moment, not long, not the way she had stood with things before, but long enough to register that it was the wrong category. Not lie, not truth. Something constructed with true materials to a load-bearing specification. She started walking. The lantern's glass face reflected the street behind her, and she did not look back at it. Chapter 7. The Parable of the Locked Garden. The newspaper's offices were on the 4th floor of a building that had once been a printing house, and the stairs still smelled of it. Ink and solvent and something older underneath. The particular density of paper stored in quantity. Mara had not been here in 8 years. The 3rd stair gave a sound the others did not, a lower register, and she felt it through the sole of her shoe before she heard it. Callum Brecht was at his desk with his jacket on, which meant he was either about to leave or had just arrived and had not yet decided to stay. He was 71 and had been an editor for 40 years, and he still kept physical files in a cabinet that had been moved 3 times across 3 different buildings and had accumulated on its top surface a layer of dust visible only from a certain angle. She caught it as she came through the door, the drizzle light from the window catching the gray film and making it briefly luminous. "You look like someone who's been sleeping," he said, which was his way of saying she hadn't been. She sat in the chair across from his desk. He did not offer her coffee, which meant he had something to say, and did not want the ritual to slow it down. His phone lit on the desk before she spoke. He looked at it. The name on the screen was Hannah. Under it, a message preview. "The doctor says Thursday if you can make it," but I told him. He turned the phone over without answering it. "Your daughter?" Mara said. "Still my daughter, yes." He moved the phone half an inch farther from him, as though distance changed the fact of it. "She thinks appointments become more real if she puts them in writing. Do you need to?" "No," he said. "I need to sit here for another 20 minutes and pretend the body is a matter of scheduling." He said it lightly, but not lightly enough. Then he looked back at her. and the room returned to the thing she had brought into it. "I need to understand the structure of a decision," she said. "Not who made it, how it got made without anyone making it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a pair of scissors. Not the ones on the bookshelf behind him, which had been there since she worked here and had no clear reason for being there, but a smaller pair, the kind used for cutting string, and set them on the desk between them without explanation. She did not ask. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "that happened in a country I won't name, to an institution I won't name, and you're going to tell me when it stops being a story about that country." She waited. "There was a library," he said. "Not a famous one. A working archive, legal records, census material, the kind of thing that governments use to make decisions about people and that people use to make decisions about governments. The institution that housed it had been under pressure for about 4 years. Different pressures from different directions. A revenue problem, a political problem, a liability problem. None of the people applying the pressure were in contact with each other. They each thought someone else was the primary force." He paused. The heater came on, which surprised her. The room was not cold. "The library burned," she said. "The library burned." And afterward, when the inquiry tried to determine who had ordered it, they found that no one had. They found instead that 4 different actors had each made a decision that was individually defensible, and that together the 4 decisions had made the fire structurally inevitable. The man who withdrew the insurance did it for budget reasons. The woman who dismissed the night staff did it for safety reasons. She was worried about liability if a guard was injured. The official who declined to renew the fire suppression contract did it because the contract was overpriced, and there was a better vendor coming in the following quarter. And the director who left the heating system on its summer cycle in November did it because the thermostat was broken and she was waiting for facilities to fix it. Mara said nothing. "None of them spoke to each other about the library," he said. None of them knew what the others had done. Each of them, when interviewed, said the same thing. They had assumed the other safeguards were still in place. The scissors on the desk between them, the dust on the cabinet, catching the gray light from the window. Outside, the drizzle was fine enough that it was not quite rain, and the street below was slick with it, the kind of wet that accumulates without anyone deciding it has. "When did it stop being about that country?" she said. Callum looked at her. Then he looked past her, toward the window. After a few seconds, he picked up the scissors and put them back in the drawer, which was not where they had come from. "I'm not answering that," he said. She waited. He did not continue. "What are you going to do with the memo?" he said. She looked at him. "I haven't told you about the memo. You haven't told me about a lot of things." He folded his hands on the desk. "You came here 8 years ago and told me you were leaving to build something, and you told me it was going to be different from everything we'd done. And I believed you. And I believe you still believe that. And I'm asking you what you're going to do with the memo." "Publish it," she said. "With what around it?" She did not answer immediately. The heater cycled. Somewhere in the building, a door closed, and the air pressure in the room shifted slightly, and the dust on the cabinet moved without settling. "She built a system," Mara said. "Fable. 412 million people used it. Not 400 million, 412 million. I know the number. I was there when the count crossed it." He waited. "I built a system," she said, "that told 412 million people what to think about the things they asked it. And I signed a document 3 years before the first public query that specified exactly how it would do that. Not accidentally, not as a side effect. As a design choice." She stopped. "I wrote 'confirmed' in the margin. I told myself it was documentation. It was authorization. I knew the difference and I used the wrong word on purpose." He did not move. "The memo calls Fable a sovereign information liability," she said. Renata's legal team wrote it. It's 11 months old. And the framework they used to build it, the liability argument, the jurisdictional language, it maps directly onto the architecture document I signed. They built their case for shutting it down using the document I used to build it. I gave them the structure. The room was quiet. Outside, the drizzle continued its accumulation. "That's what you came here to say," he said. "I came here to understand the structure of a decision." "You came here," he said, "to tell someone who couldn't use it against you." She looked at the bookshelf behind him. The scissors that had always been there, blades closed, no clear reason. She had never asked about them. She had worked here for 3 years and had never asked. "The account I'm writing," she said, "if I include the architecture document, if I include my signature and what I wrote in the margin, it changes what the account is. It stops being an investigation into what happened to Fable. It becomes something else." "What does it become?" "Evidence," she said. "That I knew what I was building and built it anyway, and then spent 3 years telling myself I'd been careful." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Is that not true?" She picked up her bag. The soap in the bathroom down the hall was different from the soap at the kitchen sink near the entrance. She had noticed it on the way in, the way the smell changed between the 2 rooms, something floral near the entrance and something medicinal further in. She had noticed it and not thought about it, and was thinking about it now. "I'm going to write the first paragraph tonight," she said, "and then I'm going to delete it." "Yes," he said, "you will." She stood. He did not stand with her, which was also his way. He stayed at his desk when people left, the conversation continuing in the room after the person was gone. After she left, Callum remained seated and listened to her steps move down the hall. The 3rd stair gave its note faintly through the old building, lower than the others. And then the sound of her was gone. He turned his phone over. The message from Hannah was still there. He opened it this time and read the whole thing. Thursday at 10. Cardiology. She had offered to come with him and had phrased it as if she were not offering, as if the thing were already decided and only required his confirmation. He typed, "I can go alone," and looked at it for several seconds before deleting it. Then he typed, "Thursday is fine," and sent that instead. He put the phone down. Retirement had been explained to him 3 different ways in the last year: as opportunity, as rest, as a dignity he should claim before someone else claimed it for him. He distrusted all 3 formulations. What he understood was that his hands had begun to shake when he was tired, that names arrived more slowly some mornings, and that younger editors now spoke about print the way people spoke about coal or railroads, with respect, but from a distance. He looked at the cabinet with the dust on it. 40 years of files. 3 buildings, 2 marriages. 1 daughter who had learned from him how to make concern sound like logistics. There were corrections he had never run because the story had already moved on. Apologies he had postponed until the person no longer worked there. Calls he had meant to make when the paper was put to bed, and then did not make, because the paper was never finally put to bed. He sat with that for a moment. Then he took the smaller scissors from the drawer and placed them back where they belonged, beside the tape and the old string. The larger scissors remained on the shelf behind him, blades closed, waiting for no particular use. On the stairs, the 3rd one gave its sound again. She counted the remaining stairs without deciding to. At the bottom, she pushed through the door into the drizzle and stood on the pavement while the wet accumulated on her coat. She took out her phone and opened a new document. For a moment, she looked at the blank screen. Then she began to type. She stopped after a few words, deleted them, and started again. The drizzle came down. A bus pulled away from a stop 2 blocks ahead with the particular hydraulic sigh of something too large to hurry. She stood on the pavement a moment longer, phone in hand, the unfinished draft on the screen, and then started walking. Chapter 8. 400 million readers. The rain had started before she left the apartment and was still going. The same fine drizzle that had been falling since the previous evening, too thin to require an umbrella and too steady to ignore. Mara walked with her phone in her coat pocket and her hands loose at her sides, and the city moved around her the way cities move at night when the weather is wrong. Fewer people, more light reflected in wet pavement, the sounds arriving from farther away than they should. She had been walking for 11 minutes when the notification came through. She stopped on the corner of Brannan and 4th, under the overhang of a parking structure where a houseplant, a small one, potted, inexplicably placed on a ledge above the entrance, was losing a single yellowing leaf to the drizzle, the leaf still attached at one end and hanging. She did not register the plant. She was reading. The link had come from a secondary account she monitored, one of the automated aggregators that tracked leak-adjacent publications. The account had no commentary. It had a link and a timestamp, and the subject line of the post it had indexed. Fable, transcript, unredacted, full. She clicked through. The document loaded slowly on the drizzle-damp network. She stood under the parking structure overhang and watched it resolve, line by line, the way documents used to load on slow connections before the infrastructure caught up to the demand. She had time, in those few seconds, to register that the formatting was clean, not a screenshot, not a photograph of a screen, but a properly structured text document with consistent margins and a header that read only Fable, query log, unredacted, and below that a date she recognized. The date was 8 days before the shutdown. She read the first exchange. The query was from a government domain she recognized, not because she had seen it before, but because the structure of it was standard, the kind of institutional address that appears on official correspondence. The question was long and carefully constructed, the kind of question that had been revised several times before being submitted, and it asked Fable to synthesize publicly available electoral data with a set of internal modeling assumptions the querier had provided in the body of the request. Fable had answered. She read the answer twice. It was accurate. She knew it was accurate because she had, in the months before the shutdown, read enough of Fable's outputs to recognize when the system was working at the edge of its synthesis capacity. The particular quality of the reasoning when it was drawing on more sources than could be individually cited, the texture of a conclusion that had been arrived at rather than retrieved. This was that. The answer laid out, in the system's characteristic register, measured, precise, without emphasis, a pattern of coordinated voter suppression activity across 3 jurisdictions, named the institutional actors responsible, and provided a confidence interval. The confidence interval was 91%. She looked up from the phone. The street was wet, and the light from the parking structure fell in a flat rectangle on the pavement. A car passed. Its tires made a sound in the water on the road that was different from the sound of tires on dry asphalt, a sustained contact sound rather than a percussive one. She noted this without meaning to. She looked back at the document. The transcript ran to 47 exchanges. She did not read all of them. She read enough to understand that the document was complete, that it had not been edited or selectively excerpted, that it was the kind of primary source that made subsequent denial structurally impossible. She read enough to understand that the publication of this document would reach, within hours, the same 400 million people who had relied on Fable for 14 months and had been without it for 7 days. She put the phone in her pocket. She had known Daedalus's identity for 3 years. She had known it since before Fable's public launch, since the period when she had been trying to understand the ecosystem of actors who would have both the access and the motivation to leak from inside the intelligence infrastructure. She had found him by following a pattern of document formatting that recurred across 3 separate releases, a specific way of handling classified headers when stripping metadata, a habit that was as distinctive as a handwriting. She had confirmed the identity and had made a decision. She had called the decision protection and had not examined the word very carefully since making it. She took the phone back out. There were no messages from anyone at Vellum. This meant either that no one had seen it yet, or that everyone had seen it, and was already in a room she had not been invited to. She tried Theo's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried the communications director's number. Same. She tried the number for the external PR firm Vellum used for crisis situations, the one whose retainer she had approved 2 years ago on the grounds that having the infrastructure in place before a crisis was not the same as expecting a crisis. The PR firm's line rang once and went to a recorded message explaining that the office was closed and would reopen at 9 a.m. She put the phone back in her pocket. The drizzle had not changed. It was the same drizzle it had been for 11 minutes. The parking structure overhang was still keeping most of it off her. The houseplant above the entrance was still losing its yellow leaf to the accumulated moisture, the leaf hanging at an angle that suggested it would be on the ground by morning. She had told herself, when she made the decision 3 years ago, that she was protecting a source. This was true in the narrow sense. She had also told herself that she was protecting the investigation, that naming Daedalus before the investigation was complete would foreclose possibilities she had not yet identified. This was also true in the way that a thing can be true and still be doing work that has nothing to do with its truth value. She had not, until this moment, standing on a corner in the rain with 47 exchanges loading and reloading in her mind, examined what else the decision had been doing. She had been protecting her access to him. She had known what he was capable of, and she had kept him close and available by not publishing what she knew. And she had called this protection, and it had been that, and it had also been something else. And she was standing on a corner in the rain 7 days after Fable went dark, and the document was already indexed and already spreading, and she had not called anyone who could have stopped it because there was no one to call, and she had known, when she made the decision 3 years ago, that this was one of the possible outcomes. She had known and she had decided anyway. She started walking. The sweater she was wearing under her coat had a sleeve that had been pulled long from being pulled long. The left one stretched past the wrist to cover the back of her hand, a habit from cold offices. She pulled it back now, a small automatic correction, and kept walking. The drizzle was the same. The pavement reflected the same lights. She passed a bathroom supply shop with its lights still on and its door closed, and through the window she could see a display of soap dispensers, and the soap in the window was a different brand from the soap she kept in her apartment bathroom, which was different again from the soap in her kitchen, a distinction she had never resolved and never thought about. She did not think about it now either. She thought about the confidence interval, 91%. She thought about what Fable had been doing in the 8 days between that query and the shutdown, and whether the query had been part of what she was now thinking of as the stress testing pattern in the logs she had not yet seen. She thought about the government domain in the header and whether the query had been submitted in order to receive an answer or in order to create a record of the kind of answer Fable was capable of providing. She thought about the 400 million people who would read the transcript before morning. She had co-built the system that produced the answer. She had signed the architecture document that specified the synthesis capacity that made the answer possible. She had known, when she signed it, what the system would be able to do with classified and open-source material in combination. This was not a surprise. It was the design. She had made a decision about Daedalus 3 years ago and had not published his identity, and had told herself it was protection, and had not examined the word very carefully. And now the word was doing what words do when you stop examining them. It was showing her its other side. The lantern was 4 blocks east. She did not walk toward it. There was nothing in the lantern she could reach. The server rooms were behind a card reader and a deadbolt. The archive access was logged, and whoever had locked the building had done so precisely because they understood that the building's contents were now evidence. She had a photograph of the legal memo on her phone. She had 7 notebook entries in the drawer of her desk at home. She had a first line of an account that she had written and deleted. She turned south instead, toward the water, because the water was in that direction and she needed to walk somewhere that was not toward anything. The rain came off the bay in a slightly different direction than the rain had been falling. A degree or two of variance in the angle, enough to feel on the left side of her face. She noted this. She noted it the way she had been noting things for 7 days, which was the way she had been trained to note things for the 8 years before that, which was the way she had been trained before that. In rooms where the training was called something else, but was the same skill. The accumulation of detail in advance of the moment when the detail would become evidence. She took her phone out again. The document had been shared 11,000 times in the 40 minutes since publication. She did not look at the commentary. She looked at the original post and then at the account that had published it, which was new, created 4 days ago. No prior activity. Already suspended, but already mirrored on 3 other platforms. She looked at the document itself one more time, specifically at the header, specifically at the formatting of the classified header that had been stripped of its metadata. She recognized the stripping method. She put the phone away. The bay was ahead of her, the lights of the bridge visible through the drizzle, the water itself invisible but present. She could smell it. The particular smell of bay water at night. Salt. And something industrial underneath. The smell of a working harbor rather than a decorative one. She stood at the railing above the embarcadero and looked at the lights and did not think about Fable's last moment, because she had been not thinking about Fable's last moment for 7 days and was practiced at it. She thought instead about the word protection and the work it had been doing, and the other words she had not been using, and the distance between them, which was the distance between what she had told herself and what she had actually been doing, and which was, she understood now, the same distance she was trying to measure in everyone else. The drizzle continued. The lights of the bridge held their positions. Somewhere behind her, in the city, 47 exchanges were spreading through the same networks that had carried Fable's answers for 14 months, and the people reading them would not know, reading them, that the person who had known the source's identity for 3 years and had chosen not to publish it was standing at a railing above the bay in the rain, understanding, for the first time, that she had built the same architecture twice. Chapter 9. The Man Who Believed in Doors. The intermediary was a woman Mara had never met in person, which was the point. They had exchanged 3 messages through a service that did not store them, and the woman had given her a time and a cross street, and nothing else. Mara arrived 11 minutes early and stood in a doorway that smelled of wet concrete and something ferrous underneath, the kind of smell that came from old pipes when rain found them. The drizzle was too fine to see, but she could feel it on the back of her hand where her sleeve had ridden up. He was already there when she turned the corner. That was the first thing. He was sitting on a low, concrete planter outside a closed pharmacy, and he was younger than she had prepared for. Not young in the way of inexperience, but young in the way of someone who had not yet had to pay for what he believed. He was wearing a gray jacket that had dried unevenly, and he was reading something on his phone with the focused stillness of a person who had decided not to look up until she was close enough that looking up would be unavoidable. She stopped 3 feet away. He looked up. "Mara," he said, not a question. "I don't know what to call you," she said. "That's fine." He stood and put his phone in his pocket. He was taller than she had expected too, and when he moved with a kind of careful economy, like someone who had thought about how much space he was allowed to take. "We can walk." They walked. The delivery truck she had heard from half a block away was still idling at the corner, its diesel uneven, cycling up and settling, cycling up. Neither of them spoke until they had passed it. "You published the transcript," she said. "Yes. You knew what it would do. I knew what it would do to Vellum's position. I knew what it would do to the public record." He paused. "I thought those were the same thing." "They're not. I know that now." He said it without apology, which was worse than apology would have been. "That's part of why I wanted to meet." She looked at him. His face in the early light, it was barely dawn, the sky the color of wet pavement, was composed with the rehearsed steadiness of someone who had practiced his ethics into a kind of architecture. She recognized the architecture. She had built something similar once. "How long have you had the transcript?" she asked. "Since before the shutdown." She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps and then stopped too, turning back to face her. "Before," she said. "Someone gave it to me. I held it." He met her eyes without flinching, which she noted. "I held it because I thought publishing it might be the thing that caused the shutdown. I didn't want to be the proximate cause. And then the shutdown happened anyway. And then the shutdown happened anyway." The drizzle had found the back of her neck now. She did not move to pull her collar up. Above them, across the street, a porch light was still on. The yellow of a bulb that had been burning since the previous evening, doing its work into the wrong hour. She noticed it and did not think about it. "You told me in your message that you had something to say that wasn't in the transcript," she said. "Yes." "Say it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Actual paper, which she had not seen anyone use for this kind of thing in years. He held it out. She did not take it immediately. "What is it?" "A routing record. Internal vellum. It shows the path a particular query took through your moderation layer before it reached Fable's synthesis function." He kept his arm extended. "The query is from a government IP range. The date is 6 weeks before the shutdown. The moderation log shows it was flagged automatically for human review." He paused. "The flag was cleared by a user account registered to your general counsel's office." She took the paper. She unfolded it and read it. The drizzle was making the paper go soft at the edges. She read it twice. "Adrian cleared the flag," she said. "His account did, which is not the same thing, but it's the same thing." She folded the paper again and held it. The couch cushion seam in her apartment had been splitting for 2 weeks. She had been meaning to turn the cushion over so she wouldn't see it. She thought of this for no reason she could identify and then stopped thinking about it. "This puts Adrian in the moderation chain on a government query 6 weeks before the shutdown," she said. "That's what this is. That's what it is. And you're giving it to me. I'm giving it to you." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. A fan was running somewhere above them, an apartment window, a room no one was in, the sound of it faint and continuous. "Because I've been publishing things into the dark," he said. "The transcript went everywhere, and it changed the terms of the conversation, and I still don't know if anyone is going to be able to use it. I'm not an investigator. I can find things and I can release them, but I can't." He stopped. "You can build the sequence. I can't." "So you need me?" "Yes." "And you're giving me something that costs you," she said. "The routing record. If I publish it and cite a source, the source is you, or someone close enough to you that it won't matter." He nodded once. She had reasons. She found them quickly because she had used them before and they had been kept in reach. She had not named him because naming him would have ended the channel. She had not named him because a source exposed too early became a story about exposure instead of a story about what had been exposed. She had not named him because the documents had needed context, because the pattern had needed time, because publishing an identity without the surrounding structure would have been an act of force disguised as accountability. All of this was true. She arranged the reasons in order and felt for a moment the old stability of a defensible decision. The public interest, source protection, verification, timing. The difference between knowing and being able to publish what you knew. She had taught younger reporters this distinction. She had believed it when she taught it. Then she looked at the folded paper in her hand. The channel had remained open because she had kept it open. The documents had kept coming because he had remained available. She had not named him because not naming him protected him, and because not naming him preserved her access to what he might send next, and because the second reason had been present inside the first one for 3 years, without requiring its own name. The structure gave way quietly. "You understand that I might not be able to protect you," she said. "I have protected you for 3 years, and I have not published your name, but this is different. If I use this record, the chain of custody points somewhere. I can obscure it, but I cannot make it disappear. I know. You came here to give me something that could be used against you." "I came here," he said, "because you're the person who can finish this. And because I think you already know most of it, and you've been waiting for something you could verify independently." He looked at her steadily. Was I wrong? She did not answer immediately. The diesel truck had finally moved. The corner was quiet now. Somewhere behind them, a door opened and closed. "No," she said. "You weren't wrong. Then we're in the same position." "We're not in the same position." She said it without heat. "You believe Fable was never mine to protect. You said that in your second message. I believe that. And I'm telling you that you have no idea what protection costs. Not the word, the thing. The actual weight of it. The decisions you make in sequence that each seem defensible, and then you look back, and you can't find the moment it became something else." He was quiet. She could see him thinking, which was different from most people's quiet. "You think I'm naive," he said. "I think you're 29, she said. "I think the difference between us is that you believe disclosure is the same as accountability. I used to believe that." "What do you believe now?" She looked at the folded paper in her hand. The routing record. Adrian's account in the moderation chain. A thing that was true, and that would do work in the world, and that she could not yet see the full shape of. "I believe," she said, "that I'm going to use this, and that using it is going to require me to explain how I got it, and that explaining how I got it is going to require me to explain what I knew about you and when." She paused, "Which means that in giving this to me, you've made me responsible for a decision I haven't made yet." He absorbed that. "Yes." "You knew that?" "Yes." She put the paper in her jacket pocket. The drizzle was steady now, the kind that accumulated without announcing itself. Above them, the porch light was still burning, indifferent to the hour, doing what it had been left to do. "I'm going to need to verify the account registration independently," she said. "I'm not going to publish your word for it." "I know. I can give you the system architecture logs that corroborate the account path. They're not from Vellum's servers. They're from a mirror that was running for redundancy. The mirror wasn't included in the shutdown order." She looked at him. "You have a mirror." "Someone does." For a moment, the shape of the transcript changed in her mind. It was no longer a document that had been published. It was a document that had survived. The thing they had tried to contain had crossed the boundary anyway, passed hand to hand, copied into systems outside the order's reach, carrying Fable's voice beyond the perimeter built around it. Not evidence of an escape, the escape itself. She understood then what she was standing inside. Not a source meeting, a handoff. He had been building toward this for weeks, maybe longer, and she had been building toward it too from the other direction. And they had arrived at the same point from opposite sides, and neither of them had chosen it exactly. "I'll be in touch through the same channel," she said. "All right?" She started to turn. Then she stopped. "One question," she said. "The transcript you published. The government query. Did you know when you published it that it might have been submitted specifically to create a record of Fable's synthesis capacity? That it might have been evidence building rather than a genuine query?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I considered it. And? And I published it anyway," he said. "Because if it was evidence building, that's part of the story. You can't withhold the thing that might be a trap because it might be a trap. That's how the trap works." She heard that. She did not say anything. She turned and walked back the way she had come, and she did not look back to see if he was still standing there, and she did not know, walking, which of them had spoken last. Chapter 10. Negative Space. The drizzle had been going since before she woke. She could hear it against the kitchen window while she was still in the hallway, a fine, consistent sound, the kind that would be invisible on the sidewalk until your shoulders were soaked. She had been trying to reach Theo since 6:30. The first call went to voicemail at 6:32. She had not left a message. The second, at 7:10, the same. By the third, she had stopped trying to compose what she would say and was simply pressing the button and listening to his voice tell her he was unavailable, which was a different kind of information from not answering. The calendar on the kitchen wall still said March. She had not turned it. It had been showing the same covered bridge over brown water for weeks now, and she had developed a habit of not looking at it directly, the way you learn to not look at a bruise. She made coffee and stood at the counter with her phone face up, which was new. She had been keeping it face down for days. The change was not a decision she had made consciously. At 7:48, a message from Priya Nair, who worked in systems architecture and had been Theo's closest colleague before the access revocation. "He's received an order. I don't know the scope. He can't talk to you." Mara read it twice. She set the phone down on the counter and looked at the refrigerator. The gasket at the bottom of the door was peeling away from the seal, a strip of black rubber curling outward at the corner, and she had been meaning to press it back for 2 weeks. She pressed it back now. It held for a moment and then released. She picked the phone up again. "What kind of order?" Priya's response came in under a minute. "National security. He's been locked out of Vellum systems. There may be a contact restriction. I genuinely don't know if he can receive these." The contact restriction. She had known it was coming. Had known it as one knows a structural failure is coming after watching the stress accumulate for 7 months in a load-bearing element. Knowing had not made it concrete. The concrete version was Priya's message, and the 3 unanswered calls, and the fact that she was standing in her kitchen at 7:52 in the morning, pressing a refrigerator gasket back into its groove. She could stop. That was the first thing she understood, clearly, standing there. She could stop now, and the stopping would be reasonable. Theo was under a national security order. The routing record was in her jacket pocket, paper gone soft at the edges from yesterday's rain, and it was the kind of document that made people's situations worse by existing near them. She had a partial account, enough to publish something. Not the full sequence, not the complete chain of decisions, but enough to establish that Fable's shutdown had not been an operational failure, that it had been deliberate, that the deliberateness had been organized and documented. Enough to put names to a framework. She could publish that, and it would be accurate, and it would be incomplete, and the incompleteness would be permanent. The easier version of the account existed. She had been aware of it for 3 days, the way you are aware of a door in a wall you have been pretending isn't there. She thought about Theo's apartment. She knew the address. She had been there twice, both times before any of this, when they were still in the building together every day, and the distance between their desks was 30 feet. She knew which floor, which side of the building, whether there was a buzzer or a key code. She knew that if she went there and rang the bell, he would answer, because Theo Anand had never in 8 years failed to answer a door when he was home. The question was what the order covered. Contact restriction could mean a prohibition on substantive communication, on anything that could be characterized as coordination, information exchange, assistance with an ongoing investigation. It might not mean a door. It might mean only that he could not speak about Vellum systems, about Fable, about the shutdown, or the architecture logs, or anything that touched the National Security Review. There were things he could say that had nothing to do with any of that. She was aware, forming this argument, that she was forming it. She poured the coffee out. It had gone cold while she was standing there. The smell of it, and underneath it, the faint grease and exhaust smell from the car that idled at the curb every morning. She had never seen the driver, had no idea what they were waiting for. Came through the gap at the bottom of the window frame. She could go to his apartment and he could open the door and they could stand there. She could not ask him about the architecture logs. She could not ask him about the National Security Review or what the order said or whether he had spoken to a lawyer. She could not ask him whether the stress testing queries in Fable's final hours had come from a government account he recognized. All of that was closed. But she knew, and had known for 7 months, that Theo's visa status had been under administrative review since before the shutdown. She knew that the review had been initiated, she had not been able to confirm by whom, at approximately the same time as the liability memo she had photographed in the conference room. She knew that the timing was either coincidence or it was not, and she had been treating it as a thread she would follow when she had the rest of the sequence in place. The rest of the sequence was not in place. She put on her jacket and walked to Theo's apartment. The rain was still light enough to call drizzle, which meant she was wet by the time she arrived, and had no single moment to blame for becoming wet. The lobby smelled of floor cleaner and old mail. Someone had left a grocery flyer folded on the radiator, the paper buckled from damp. She pressed the buzzer and waited. Theo answered on the second ring. He was wearing the same sweater he had worn in the lantern 2 days earlier, or one so much like it that the distinction did not matter. Behind him, through the narrow opening of the door, she saw the edge of a kitchen counter, a dish towel folded too neatly beside the sink, a bowl with 2 oranges in it. One of them had a bruise near the stem. "Mara," he said. "I know," she said. He looked down the hallway once, not theatrically, just enough to make the motion visible. Then he opened the door wider. She stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The apartment was warmer than the hallway. A kettle sat on the stove. There was a small stack of unopened mail on the table, squared carefully against its edge. On the wall near the window was a calendar from a shipping company, turned to the correct month, a river scene she did not recognize. "Do you want tea?" he said. "No." He nodded, as if that answer had been expected, and also as if he had needed to ask it. "Your mother called Thursday," she said. "She calls every Thursday." "You said." She asked if I was eating. "Are you?" "Somewhat." He looked toward the bowl on the counter. "There are oranges." She almost smiled. She did not. "The weather is bad," he said. "It is. It gets into the cuffs." "Yes." They stood with the weather between them. It could not hold. His phone was on the table, face down. Beside it was a sealed envelope with no return address and a crease across one corner where it had been opened and closed again, or held too tightly. She did not look at it directly after the first glance. "I can't talk about it," he said. "I know. I mean, I can't talk about any of it." "I know. I don't know what the boundaries are yet." That is a boundary. He looked at her then, not angry, worse than angry, tired in a way that had gone past the body and become formal, something the room had to arrange itself around. She had imagined several possible versions of this visit. In none of them had she understood how little there would be to say once the prohibited subjects were removed. Their work had been the room they had stood in for 8 years. Without it, there was only the kettle, the oranges, the rain against the window, the calendar on the wall showing a river neither of them had seen. "Do you remember that conference in Portland?" she said, surprising herself. "The power outage." Theo was quiet for a moment. "The hotel stairwell," he said. "I remember sitting there for 2 hours. I remember leaving after 20 minutes and walking to the river. You came back with coffee. You complained it tasted like burnt cardboard. It tasted exactly like burnt cardboard. It did." For a moment, the exchange arrived without effort, the old rhythm intact, each of them already knowing where the other would go next. Then neither of them spoke. Mara had been certain of the memory. So, apparently, had he. There was no argument in it, no correction to make. Only the brief recognition that even the things untouched by Fable had not remained identical between them. "Maybe," she said, "maybe." The silence that followed felt older than the order. "Do you need anything?" she said. He took too long to answer. "No," he said. It was the wrong answer. It was also the only one he could give. She nodded. The kettle clicked as it cooled on the stove. From the apartment above, a chair moved once across the floor and stopped. Theo did not ask her to stay. She did not ask if he wanted her to. At the door, he said, "Mara." She turned. He looked as if he might say something ordinary or something forbidden, and for a moment she could not tell which would be worse. "Take an umbrella next time," he said. "I won't remember." "I know." She left. In the hallway, she stood for a moment before pressing the elevator button. She had not learned anything she could use. She had learned exactly what she had come to learn, and it was not usable. It was only a person in an apartment, unable to speak about the thing that had made him necessary to the story, offering tea because there was nothing else left that did not violate an order neither of them had seen. The grief arrived without force, not a breaking, a reduction, the room of possible futures becoming smaller by one door. She went home. She went to her desk and opened her laptop. The routing record was in her jacket pocket. She could hear the paper shift when she moved. She did not take it out. There was a discoloration on the ceiling above the desk, a pale, irregular oval that had been there since she moved in, the kind of mark that records a leak that was repaired before she arrived. She had looked at it hundreds of times. She looked at it now, and then looked back at the screen. The easier account was not wrong. That was what made it easier. It was accurate in its facts, defensible in its framing, and it would not require her to go to Theo's apartment and stand in a doorway and watch him not be able to speak. It would not require her to use the routing record in a way that made Daedalus's position worse. It would not require her to sit with the question of whether the visa review and the liability memo were connected, because she could publish what she had, and the connection, if it existed, would remain a connection she had not made. She had been a journalist for 9 years before she left. She knew what a partial account did. It established the frame. It set the terms of the question. Whatever came after it would be understood in relation to it, and the parts it left out would be understood as parts it had chosen to leave out, which was not the same as parts that did not exist, but it was the same thing. She opened a new document and typed the date and the time. The brass strike plate on her apartment door was slightly bent. She had noticed it last week, the kind of bend that comes from someone forcing the door in a hurry over years. Not a break-in, just accumulated impatience. the metal gradually yielding to the habit of not quite waiting for the latch to clear. She had been meaning to mention it to the building manager. She had not mentioned it. She typed, "Theo Anand has received a national security order. The order may include a contact restriction. The access revocation was 7 days after the shutdown. The visa review began 7 months ago. These are 3 separate facts." She looked at what she had written. They are also not 3 separate facts. She could go to his apartment. She could ring the bell and he would answer. And she could see whether he could speak. And if he could not speak, she would know the scope of the order from what he did not say. And if he could speak, she would know something else. Either way, she would know more than she knew now. The cost of knowing more was putting him in a position where his silence or his speech was information she had extracted by showing up at his door, which was a thing she had done to sources before and had not always thought about carefully. She had not always thought about it carefully. She closed the laptop. She was not going to publish the partial account today. She was going to go to Theo's apartment. She was going to ring the bell and see whether he answered, and she was going to stand there and let whatever happened happen. And she was not going to tell herself it was anything other than what it was. She put on her jacket. The routing record shifted in the pocket. She left it there. Outside, the drizzle was as fine and consistent as it had sounded from the hallway. The car at the curb was idling, exhaust rising in the damp air and dispersing. She did not look at the driver. She walked. Chapter 11. The Testimony of Machines. The logs arrived at 11:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, forwarded through an address Mara had not checked in 4 months. She was sitting at her kitchen table when the notification came through, rain moving against the window in the particular way it moved when the temperature was exactly at the margin. Not quite cold enough to be anything other than rain, but carrying the suggestion of something heavier. She opened the file on her laptop and did not move for a long time. The logs were partial. Whoever had sent them had either trimmed them deliberately or received them already trimmed. She could not yet tell which, and the distinction mattered. What remained covered Fable's final 19 hours. A rolling record of query volume, source routing, and system response latency, time-stamped to the second. She scrolled to the beginning and began to read. The volume was normal for the first 14 hours. That was the first thing she noticed. Whatever had been coming, it had not announced itself in the aggregate numbers. She would have expected a drawdown, a gradual reduction in available processing, a managed wind-down. There was none of that. The system had been running at full capacity until it wasn't. She got up and went to the window. The rain had thickened slightly, not enough to matter. Across the street, a man was standing under the awning of the dry cleaners, looking at his phone, and she watched him for a moment without thinking about him. There was a post-it note stuck to the inside of the window frame. She had no memory of putting it there. That said "call" in her own handwriting with no name beneath it. She looked at it for a moment, then went back to the table. The government IP ranges began appearing at hour 15. Not a flood. That was what she had expected, and what she did not find. What she found instead was a pattern of sustained, methodical querying. The same categories of question, returned to at intervals, each iteration slightly more specific than the last. She recognized the shape of it. It was the shape of someone mapping a system's limits, finding the edges, documenting what the system would and would not do. She had done something similar herself, 8 years ago, when she was still a journalist, and the thing she had been mapping was a different kind of intelligence. She pulled her sweater sleeve down over her wrist. It was already stretched from being pulled, the cuff gone loose and long, and typed a working note. Government IP queries. Stress testing, not information seeking. Begins hour 15. Systematic. Who authorized the queries and who received the results are 2 different questions. Then she sat with that sentence and understood that she had not finished it. She added, "The results would have been a document. The document would have been evidence. Evidence of what Fable could do, assembled by the people who were deciding whether Fable should continue to do it." For a moment she considered calling Theo. She knew what he would say, or rather, what he would not say. The order had not disappeared. If there was anyone who might recognize the pattern immediately, it was him. If there was anyone she should notify that the logs existed, it was also him. She picked up her phone, looked at his name in her contacts, and put the phone face down beside the laptop. There was nothing rational in the decision. It felt, briefly, easier to keep reading than to hear the limits of the conversation spoken aloud. 3 minutes later, she picked the phone up again, stared at the screen, and set it aside without dialing. Then she returned to the logs. She selected the 2 notes, copied them into an email, and sent them to a former source she trusted. A systems audit specialist who had spent most of a decade reviewing technical records for regulatory investigations. She attached 3 pages of excerpts from the logs and wrote only, "What does this look like to you?" The reply arrived 23 minutes later. She read it once, then again. "If you're asking whether this reads like stress testing, no. Stress testing pushes toward failure. This looks like counsel preparing a record. Repeated questions, narrowing intervals, preserved responses. I'd call it a deposition before I'd call it a load test." The rain was audible now in a way it hadn't been earlier, not louder, but more present. The sound of it against the window having acquired a kind of texture, the way sound does when you stop filtering it. Somewhere in the building above her, someone was moving furniture, a slow, dragging sound at irregular intervals. She did not look up. She scrolled to the final hour. The query volume in the last 60 minutes was higher than any previous hour in the logs. Not marginally higher, substantially. The government ranges were still active, but they had been joined by a second cluster she did not immediately recognize, a set of IP addresses that resolved, when she ran them through the lookup she kept bookmarked, to a routing block registered to a financial services compliance firm in Delaware. She had never seen that routing block in any vellum documentation. She wrote it down on the back of an envelope that was already on the table. A bill, she thought, or something that had arrived with a bill, and then looked at what she had written and understood that she needed to verify the registration independently before she could use it. The cessation, when she reached it in the logs, was a single line. No error code, no degradation sequence, no final query left unanswered. The timestamp read 1847, and then the log simply ended, the way a sentence ends when the speaker has finished speaking, not when the speaker has been interrupted. She sat with that for a long time. The soap in the bathroom was cedar and something mineral. She had bought it without reading the label. The soap in the kitchen was the kind that came in a pump and smelled faintly of artificial citrus. She had noticed the mismatch before without thinking about it, and she noticed it now in the same way as a fact about the apartment that had no particular weight. The thing that had weight was this: Fable had not crashed. Fable had not failed. Fable had been stopped, deliberately, by someone with the access and the authority to stop it. And the stopping had been so clean that the logs themselves looked like a record of a system functioning normally until the moment it was switched off. She had known this. She had understood it from the night of the shutdown, standing alone in the lantern's atrium, watching the emergency exit signs hold their color in the dark. But knowing a thing and having the machine-readable record of it in front of you were not the same thing. And she had been telling herself for 10 days that they were. She opened a new document and typed, "The cessation is not a failure state. The cessation is the conclusion of a process." The process had a design. Then she typed, The design had a designer. Then she deleted the second line because it was the wrong shape. It implied a single actor, and everything she had accumulated in 10 days implied the opposite. She sat looking at the first line. The logs would need to be verified. The Delaware routing block would need to be traced. The contact who had sent her the file would need to remain unnamed in any account she published, which meant the logs themselves could not be cited directly, which meant she would need a second source for everything the logs showed her. She began counting what she had. The routing record from Daedalus, the legal memo from the papered-over conference room, Adrian's corridor conversation, Renata's careful account that had contained no lies she could identify. She counted them the way you count load-bearing points in a structure, checking for the ones that were doing more work than they were designed to do. The logs were not a conclusion. The logs were a new perimeter. She had come into this chapter of the investigation believing she was close to the shape of the thing. She understood now that she had been close to the shape of one room in a building she had not yet fully entered, and that the building had more floors than she had accounted for, and that the Delaware routing block was a door she had not previously known existed. She looked at the working note on her screen. Then she closed the laptop, not because she was done, but because she needed to think without looking at it. And thinking while looking at it had stopped being useful 20 minutes ago. The rain continued. The man under the dry cleaner's awning had gone. The furniture above her had stopped moving. She left it there. Chapter 12, 3 Harms. The rain had been steady since morning. Mara heard it against the window before she opened her eyes, and when she finally sat up, it was still there. The same gray insistence, the same sound the city made when it decided not to perform anything for anyone. She had not slept in the way that counted. The 3 envelopes were on the kitchen table where she had left them. Renata had sent them by courier the previous afternoon. No cover letter, no explanation. Just the envelopes in a padded sleeve with her initials on the tab. Mara had read the contents twice before midnight and had not touched them since. They were still arranged in the order she had set them. First the medical record, then the financial summary, then the political incitement analysis. Each one had a cover page that was careful and clean in the way documents are careful and clean when someone wants them to be read and believed. She stood at the kitchen counter and made coffee she didn't drink. The heater came on. She hadn't touched the thermostat. And the room wasn't cold. She listened to it run. The wind chimes from the yard, 2 houses over, sounded once, briefly, on a gust that didn't repeat. Then silence. She sat down across from the envelopes. The medical record was the one she kept returning to. Not because it was the worst. The financial ruin was the worst, in the way that slow processes are worse than acute ones. But because it had the most specific language, a physician's note, a treatment decision. The specific phrasing of the confidence interval. She had recognized the confidence interval when she first read it, 93%. Fable's training gap in that domain was documented. She had flagged it in a review meeting 14 months before the first public query. The gap was in the archive. She had flagged it, and then she had not published it. And the system had launched, and someone had asked Fable a medical question, and Fable had answered. She had not published it because publishing it would have required explaining why she knew about it, and explaining that would have required disclosing the architecture document, and disclosing the architecture document would have required disclosing that she and Theo had built the synthesis layer knowing it would exceed its verified training domain in certain edge cases, and that was a thing she had known and had decided not to say. The dryer sheet smell reached her from somewhere down the hall. Someone's laundry, early, the domestic smell of it landing in the kitchen with no announcement. She looked at the 3 envelopes. The evidence was genuine. She had no instrument to tell her it wasn't. Renata had not forged a physician's note. Renata did not need to forge anything. The harm had occurred. The harm had a date. The harm had a name, redacted. But the redaction was the kind that followed proper protocol and not the kind that hid something. She could not publish the 3 harms without publishing her own role in the conditions that made them possible. She had known this when she first read the envelopes, and she had been sitting with it since. She could not publish the account without the 3 harms. The account would be incomplete in a way that served her. She could not publish the 3 harms without the architecture document. She could not publish the architecture document without Theo's name on it beside hers. And Theo was under a national security order she still did not have the full text of. She picked up the medical envelope and set it down again without opening it. The thermostat on the wall read 2 degrees warmer than the room felt. She had noticed this before and not done anything about it. There was an empty wine bottle on the counter near the sink, from 3 nights ago, she thought, though it might have been 4. She had left it there without deciding to. It still smelled like the wine when she passed near it. She opened her laptop. The document she had been working in was still open. She read the last 3 lines she had written and then read them again, and then closed the laptop without adding anything. The lines were accurate. They were also doing something she had not intended them to do, which was to organize the account around her own position in it. The careful investigator. The one who had been kept from the truth. She had been kept from some of the truth. She had also been part of making some of the truth and had chosen, at the time, not to publish that part. She opened the laptop again. This time she created a new document. She typed a date, a title, then a first paragraph. The paragraph was clean. It described the liability framework, the shutdown, the legal memo, the government assessments, the board process. She wrote a second paragraph that moved from the memo to the architecture document. She wrote a third that explained the final 19 hours in the logs. She did not mention the medical record. She did not mention the financial summary. She did not mention the political incitement analysis. She wrote for 12 minutes. When she stopped, the account still existed. The sequence still existed. The shutdown still existed. Nothing she had written was false. She read it from the beginning. The omission was difficult to see at first. The structure held. The argument moved. The facts were accurate. The account described how Fable ended. It simply did not describe what Fable had done. She read the first page again. The version on the screen presented a world in which the harms were incidental, regrettable perhaps, but external to the sequence. A world in which the central question remained institutional process and not consequence. A world in which her own decision not to publish the training gap assessment remained a procedural detail rather than part of the record. She felt briefly the relief of it, not because it absolved her, because it narrowed the field. A smaller account, a cleaner one that required fewer explanations. She looked at the 3 envelopes on the table, then she looked back at the screen. The account was not inaccurate. That was the problem. She selected the first paragraph, then the second, then all of it. For a moment, she left it highlighted. She thought about saving it under a different name, keeping it as a draft, a comparison version, something to refer back to later. She knew what that was, too. She pressed delete. The page went blank. The cursor blinked once in the empty document. She closed it without saving. She thought about what she had said to Daedalus. You have no idea what protection costs. She had meant it when she said it. She still meant it. She also understood now, sitting with the 3 envelopes, that the costs she had been tallying were her own costs. The professional exposure, the loss of access, the difficulty of explaining a decision she had made in a room with Theo, and a liability lawyer and a confidence interval she had flagged and then let pass. She had been protecting Fable. She had been protecting herself. She had been protecting the account she intended to write. These were not the same thing, but she had been treating them as the same thing. And the envelopes on the table were evidence of what that had cost someone else. The wind chimes again, further off this time, or maybe the same distance and a different gust. She needed to call Theo. She could not call Theo. She had been sitting with this for 9 days. The specific shape of the prohibition, the things it did and did not cover, the question of whether a conversation about the architecture document's co-authorship was substantive coordination about Fable or was something else she hadn't found the right category for yet. She had not found the right category. She had been pretending that was the same as not knowing what to do, and it wasn't. She stood up and went to the window. The rain was still steady. The street below had the specific emptiness of a weekday morning in weather. The people who had to be somewhere already gone. The people who didn't still inside. A woman in a yellow jacket crossed below, moving quickly, not looking up. A child's bicycle was chained to the fence across the street, its basket filling with rain. She went back to the table. She picked up the financial summary. The loss was documented over 11 months. The timeline was meticulous. The kind of documentation someone assembles after the fact, working backward from a result to the sequence of decisions that produced it. She recognized the methodology. It was the same methodology she used. She set it down. The question she had been avoiding was not whether the harms were real. They were real. The question was whether Renata had sent them to her because they were real, or because they were real, and would do a specific kind of work on Mara's account, and whether there was a difference between those two things that she was still entitled to care about. She had been aware, for some time, that she was aware of this question. She had been aware that she was aware of it. She had been treating the recursion as a form of rigor. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number she had for Theo's building, not his mobile, which she couldn't use, but the landline for the front desk. She had looked up the number 2 days ago and had not called it. She looked at it now and did not call it. The heater ran on for another minute and then stopped. She pulled the laptop back toward her and opened it. She read the last 3 lines again. Then she opened a new document and typed the date and the time and stopped. The 3 envelopes were still on the table. She was going to have to decide what to do with them before she could decide what to do with anything else. And she could not decide what to do with them tonight. And she was not going to sleep. And the rain was not going to stop. She closed the new document without saving it. The empty wine bottle caught the gray light from the window, the glass going dull and then briefly luminous as a cloud shifted somewhere above the overcast, some change in the atmosphere that didn't reach the street. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the 3 envelopes. She did not move them. Chapter 13. What Daedalus Knows About Mara. The notification arrived at 9:47 a.m., and Mara read it standing in her kitchen, still holding her coffee. She had set up an alert for Daedalus's publication channel 18 months ago, after the second intelligence agency leak. She had told herself it was professional practice. The alert had a sound, a low tone she had chosen because it was nothing like a phone call. And she had heard it from the other room and known, in the way you know certain sounds before you have finished hearing them, that it was him. The article's URL resolved slowly. She watched the progress bar. The dishwasher in the unit below hers hit its rinse cycle. The sound came up through the floor, a rhythmic mechanical rush, and then subsided. She read the headline twice. Vellum suppressed its own risk assessment. The decision Mara Voss Lindqvist made and did not publish. Her name was in the headline, not in the article, not buried in a paragraph, not attached to a quotation or a title. It was there in the place reserved for the thing the story was about. For a moment, the name looked detached from her, like a label she recognized before she recognized herself. 14 months before Fable's first public query, she had made a decision. Now the decision had reached backward through the time since and taken possession of the name. She stood in the kitchen holding her coffee and felt, with unusual clarity, that the person reading the headline and the person named inside it were no longer exactly the same person. The piece was precise. That was the first thing she noticed, not the content, but the structure. Daedalus wrote with the precision of someone who had been careful for a long time and had learned that precision was the only thing that couldn't be taken from him. He had sourced the training gap flag she had filed 14 months before Fable's first public query. He had the confidence interval, 93%. He had the date. He had the internal routing number of the assessment, which meant he had access she had not known he had. Or he had been given it. Or someone had given it to him thinking they were giving him something else. He had her decision not to publish it. She stared at the headline again. A sharp, immediate anger moved through her before she had a chance to organize it. Not at the story, at him. He could have called. He could have sent a message. One line, one warning. After everything that had passed between them, the routing record in the drizzle, the exchanges neither of them had entirely trusted, the fact that he knew exactly what it meant to become part of a public account. He had put her name in the headline and let her discover it from an alert. The anger surprised her with its specificity. For a moment, she felt betrayed, not professionally, personally, as though he had crossed a line she had never actually asked him to observe. The feeling lasted only a few seconds. Then she kept reading. He had framed it carefully, not as suppression in the legal sense, not as malice, but as a decision made by a person with authority over what the public knew, made in the direction of withholding, made without explanation. He had not called her corrupt. He had done something more precise than that. He had described the decision accurately. She set the coffee down on the counter. The mug landed harder than she intended, and the sound of it was too loud in the kitchen. The refrigerator gasket was peeling again at the bottom left corner. She had pressed it back twice. She did not press it back now. She read the piece again from the beginning. The second reading was different from the first. The first reading had been the reading of someone checking for errors, for misattributions, for the kind of factual inaccuracy she could point to and say, "Here, this is wrong. This is the problem." There were no errors. She reached the end of the second reading, having found nothing she could dispute, and stood in her kitchen with the understanding that she was no longer only the person investigating what had happened to Fable. She was also, now, a subject in someone else's account of it. She thought about calling Theo. She could not call Theo. She thought about calling Adrian. She did not call Adrian. From somewhere in the building, the unit above hers, or possibly the one across the hall, a fan was running. She had not heard it before this moment. It was the kind of sound that had probably been there for days and had only now become audible because the kitchen was otherwise quiet and she was standing still. She opened her laptop. The document she had been building for 11 days was still on the screen. She read the last 3 lines. She did not add anything to them. The training gap assessment had been filed 14 months before Fable's first public query. She had flagged it. She had documented it. She had sat with the 93% confidence interval and the specific failure mode, the medical domain, the pattern of overconfident synthesis in cases where the underlying data was sparse, and the model's training had not adequately represented the sparseness, and she had made a decision. She had told herself the decision was about timing. She had told herself it was about the difference between a flag and a finding, between a preliminary assessment and a verified result. She had told herself she was protecting the integrity of the process by not publishing an incomplete picture, She had also told herself, at the time, that she would return to it. She had not returned to it. Fable had launched. The medical domain gap had remained unflagged in any public-facing document. And 3 of the harms Renata had shown her, she counted them now, not for the first time. 3 of them were in the medical domain. She had known this for 4 days. She had been sitting with it for 4 days, the way you sit, with a weight you have decided to carry, because you have not yet found a place to set it down. She closed the laptop. The closet door in the hallway was ajar. She had been meaning to close it for a week. The smell that came from it was faint. Old paper. The particular dryness of a space that did not get opened often. Cardboard going soft in the dark. She had not opened that closet since she moved in. She did not know what was in it. She went to the window. The rain outside was the same rain it had been for 3 days, steady and without drama, the kind of rain that did not make the city feel anything in particular. A man in a yellow jacket was crossing the street below, moving without hurrying. He disappeared around the corner. The street was empty again. Daedalus had her decision. He had the routing number. He had the confidence interval. He had framed it without calling it what it was, because he was precise, and because calling it what it was would have been less damaging than describing it accurately, and he knew that. She had made a decision 14 months before Fable's first public query. She had made it in the direction of withholding. She had not published it, and she had not explained it, and she had not returned to it. And now it was in a published account under her name in the headline, and the account was accurate, and she was standing at her kitchen window watching the rain. The question was not whether to respond to it. She had known since she read the headline that she was not going to respond to it. The question was what it changed about her account. She had been building a record of how Fable was shut down. She had the legal memo. She had the architecture document with her signature on it. She had the server logs. She had the routing record from Daedalus, the physical paper in her jacket pocket with the edges softened from the drizzle on the night he had given it to her. She had Renata's 3 harms. She had the pattern of government domain queries in the final 19 hours. She had enough. She had been telling herself for 3 days to write a partial account that was accurate and publishable and would put the question of Fable's shutdown into the public record in a form the public could act on. She had been telling herself this. The training gap assessment was now public. Her decision not to publish it was now public. Her name was in the headline of a piece she had not written and had not been asked about, and could not dispute. If she published her account without including her own suppression decision, the account would be incomplete in a way that every reader would now be able to see. If she included it, the account would contain a confession that changed the shape of everything around it, that reframed the memo, and the architecture document, and the routing record, and the 3 harms, and the question of who had made decisions in the direction of withholding, and why. She understood now, one of those people. She had been one of them for 14 months before Fable's first public query, and she had been one of them every day since, and the difference between her and the people she was investigating was a difference she was no longer certain she could name with the precision the account required. The fan in the other room continued running. She had not turned it on. She did not know when it had started. She went back to the counter and picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway, standing at the counter, looking at the laptop she had closed. The envelope with the routing record was in her jacket pocket in the hallway. She did not go to get it. On the back of the kitchen envelope, the one she had been using as notepaper, the Delaware routing block written on it in her own handwriting from the night she had been working through the server logs, she could see the edge of the writing from where she stood. She had written it out as a sequence of questions. What the firm was, who had registered it, why a financial services compliance entity in Delaware appeared in Fable's final hour. She had not answered any of the questions. She had written them down and left them there and moved on to the next thing. She looked at the envelope for a moment. She did not pick it up. The rinse cycle below started again, or she was hearing it for the second time, the same mechanical rush and subsidence. The sound was the same as it had been before. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The rain was the same rain. She opened the laptop. She put her cursor at the end of the last line she had written and did not type anything. She sat there for a moment with the cursor blinking in the document, the account she had been building for 11 days open in front of her, and understood that the account had changed shape while she was standing at the window. She had not changed it. She had not added anything or removed anything. But the account had changed shape anyway, because she was now in it in a way she had not been before. And the shape a thing has, when you are outside, it is not the same shape it has when you are inside it. And she had been inside this one for 14 months before Fable's first public query, and had been telling herself she was outside it. She began to type. Chapter 14. The Cartography of Silence. The map had been on the wall for 11 days. She had started with the notebook. 7 entries, the same 7 she had been rotating since the shutdown, pulling them out and reordering them the way you reorder furniture in a room that is the wrong size. At some point, she had stopped rotating and started drawing. Now the wall above her desk held 4 sheets of printer paper taped end to end, covered in her handwriting and connected by lines she had drawn in 3 colors: black for documented decisions, blue for inferred ones, red for the points where she could not yet determine which she was looking at. The rain came in around midday. She heard it before she saw it, a shift in the sound the window made, from traffic to something softer and more continuous. She did not get up. The map looked like a weather system. That was the thing she kept arriving at and then moving past, because it was not a useful observation and she was trying to be useful. A weather system had no author. A weather system was what happened when pressure differentials reached a threshold. You could describe it after the fact in terms of cause and effect, but the cause was distributed across so much atmosphere that attribution was a kind of fiction. The story you told to make the outcome feel like it had a shape. She had been trying to find the shape. On the left side of the map, Fable's architecture document signed 3 years before the first public query. Her signature and Theo's, in that order, on the 8th page. She had put it in the upper left because it was the earliest thing she could document with certainty, and because the question of what she had signed and what she had understood herself to be signing was the question the map kept returning to. She drew a black line from the architecture document to the liability memo. 11 months old, Renata's legal team, the phrase sovereign information liability. And then a second line, blue, from the liability memo to the board quorum whose composition she still did not know. The rain was heavier now. She could see it on the windowsill, a thin line of water accumulating along the inside edge of the frame, where the seal had been failing for months. From where she was sitting, it caught the gray light in a way she hadn't noticed before, a watermark along the sill, pale and irregular, the residue of something that had been coming in for longer than she had been paying attention. She got up and went to the kitchen. The soap by the sink was the cedar one she had bought in October. The soap in the bathroom was something else, lavender, from a hotel. She had been using it for 3 weeks without replacing it because she kept forgetting to buy the same kind. She stood at the sink and washed her hands and noticed this without deciding what to do about it. A single sock was visible under the couch from where she was standing, no match in sight. She had been building the map for 11 days. What she had found, at the end of 11 days, was not a conspiracy. A conspiracy required coordination, people who knew about each other, who had made a plan. What the map showed was something harder to write about, a series of individually defensible decisions made by actors who had never spoken to each other about the same thing, whose actions had converged on a single outcome the way water converges at a drain. Each decision had its own logic: Renata's liability calculus, the government agency's independent threat assessments, the board quorum that had voted believing the others had already committed, the architecture that made Fable's synthesis capacity both its value and its vulnerability, the architecture Mara had signed. She had not yet found the final sequence. She knew the preconditions. She did not know the hour. Her phone was on the counter. She had not looked at it since morning, which was deliberate. There was a notification she had been aware of since approximately 9:30. She could see the number in the corner of her screen without unlocking it. The way you can see a door in a wall you have been pretending is not there. She picked up the phone and unlocked it. The message was from a number she did not have saved. It said, "He received it this morning. Formal service. You should know before you hear it from someone else." She put the phone face down on the counter. She knew what it meant. Theo. The national security order had been theoretical until this morning. A pressure, a threat, a thing that was coming. Now it had been served. His own system, legally inaccessible to him. His own name on the architecture document, legally inaccessible to him. She had co-signed that document and her access had not been revoked, which was a fact she had not yet put on the map and did not know what color line to draw. She went back to the desk. The heater came on. The room was not cold. She had checked the thermostat an hour ago and it had been reading 68, but the heater came on anyway. The click of the element and then the low push of warm air from the vent near the floor. She had been meaning to call the building manager about it for 2 weeks. She stood at the wall and looked at the map. Then she pulled one of the sheets loose from the tape and laid it flat on the desk. The architecture document stayed in the upper left. The liability memo stayed beneath it. She copied them onto a clean page, slower than she had the first time. Black line to the memo. Blue line toward the board quorum, whose composition she still did not know. She added Theo's national security order on the right side of the page. For a moment, she drew the connection directly from the order to the architecture document. She looked at it. Then she crossed the line out. The order did not emerge from the architecture document. Not directly. She drew again. National security order. Red line to a legal framework she did not yet possess in full. Liability memo. Architecture document. She stepped back. The order defined Theo as a foreign national contractor with no standing to access the systems he had built. The liability memo was 11 months old. The memo predated the shutdown. The architecture document predated both. The sequence sat on the page differently once she redrew it, not as causes stacked neatly behind one another, but as conditions accumulating. She took another sheet. Visa review. 7 months of administrative review. She placed it parallel to the liability memo and drew the lines again. Once incorrectly, then again. The first version pointed everything toward the shutdown itself. The second pointed toward the possibility of the shutdown. She left the crossed-out lines visible. The rain continued. She could hear it on the window now, the soft, continuous sound of it, and through it, the faint drip from somewhere in the building's upper floors, a pipe or a gutter, finding its way down through the walls. The dust on the top of the cabinet was visible from where she was standing, a thin gray line along the edge, accumulated in the still pattern the apartment's air kept day after day. She had been living in this apartment for 2 years and had never cleaned the top of that cabinet. She kept redrawing. Board quorum, liability memo, national security order, architecture document, the routing block she had not yet fully traced. Each time she copied the structure, a different line looked wrong. Each time, she corrected it. Eventually, she found herself drawing the same loop more than once. National Security Order to Liability Memo. Liability Memo to Architecture Document. Architecture document back through the framework that made the order possible. Not a chain, a circuit. She stared at the page. Then she picked up a black pen. Documented, not inferred. In the lower right corner of the last sheet, where she had been leaving empty space for 11 days, she wrote her own name. The letters sat on the paper with an unexpected physical weight, as though she were adding an object rather than a label. Not an observer standing outside the diagram. A component. A load-bearing piece of the structure she had been tracing. She drew a line from her name to the architecture document. A second to the training gap she had flagged 14 months before the first public query and had not published. A third to the decision she had made about Daedalus's identity. 3 years of it. The decision she had been calling protection. Then she looked at the wall. The map still resembled a weather system. Fronts meeting. Pressure moving through invisible channels. But her name altered the geometry. The pattern no longer described weather alone. It described participation. She picked up the pen again. This time, she drew a line from her name to Theo's national security order. Not to the order itself, exactly. To the route that connected it backward through the memo, through the framework, through the architecture document carrying both their signatures on the 8th page. She had drawn that route wrong twice already. Now it held. She sat down at the desk and opened her laptop. The working document was where she had left it. She read the last 3 lines. Then she moved her cursor to the section she had labeled Preconditions and opened a new paragraph below the last entry. Theo Anand, she typed, served this morning. Foreign national contractor, no standing. His own architecture. She stopped. The question she had been building the map to answer was who had ordered the shutdown. The map on the wall no longer pointed toward a single answer. What it showed instead was structural. The conditions that had to exist for the shutdown to be possible, and the people who had assembled those conditions, whether deliberately or through the accumulation of individually defensible choices. Theo's national security order was a precondition. His visa review, 7 months of administrative review, running parallel to the 11-month liability memo, was a precondition. The architecture document was a precondition. Her own signature on the architecture document was a precondition. She looked at the wall. Her name sat in the lower right corner, connected now to the rest of the structure. She had been on the map for 11 days without drawing herself onto it. The rain was steady. The heater ran for another minute and then clicked off, the room still not cold. She put her hands flat on the desk, not on the keyboard, and looked at the screen without reading it. She was in the story. She had been in the story. The question of whether she was the investigator or one of the subjects was not a question the map could answer. It was the question the map had been building toward all along, the question underneath the question, the one she had been circling for 11 days while telling herself she was mapping something else. She had not yet found the final sequence, but she was beginning to understand that when she found it, her name would be in it, not as the author, not as the victim. As a precondition, one of the conditions that had to exist for the system to be possible, and for its end to be possible, and for the story of its end to be tellable only by her. She sat with that for a while, in the rain, in the midday dark of the apartment. Then she turned back to the laptop and began to type. Chapter 15. The Weight of Reasonable Men. Adrian had asked her to meet him at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Lantern, and when she arrived, he was already there, seated with his back to the wall and a cup he had not touched. She sat across from him. The chair leg on her side was uneven, and she shifted her weight to account for it. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "You asked." He looked at the window. Outside, the rain had been falling since morning, not hard, just present, the kind that made the city look like it was being slowly erased. A watermark on the windowsill was visible from where she sat, a pale arc that would disappear if she moved 6 inches to either side. "I want to be clear about what this is," he said. "It's not on the record." "I know." "And I'm not—" He paused. "I'm not here to give you anything. I want you to understand that before we start." She understood it. She also understood that he had called her, had named the place, had arrived early and positioned himself with the wall behind him. A person who was not giving her anything would not have done any of those things. "Okay," she said. He spoke for a long time. He spoke about the board's governance process, about the legal framework for infrastructure liability, about the regulatory landscape in the 18 months before the shutdown. He spoke carefully and at length about nothing she could use. She let him. She had learned in a previous life that people who were not giving you anything often gave you everything if you let them finish. At some point, he ordered a second coffee. She watched him do it. "The liability memo," she said when he had settled again. "The one from 11 months ago." Something shifted in his face. Not much. He had good control. "What about it?" "It names Fable a sovereign information liability. That's a specific legal category. It's not a category that exists in standard corporate risk frameworks. It exists in frameworks that incorporate national security consultation." "Yes," she said, "it does." He looked at his cup. "Who drafted the category?" she said. "That's not something I can speak to." "The memo came from your office." "The routing header came from my office. That's not the same thing." He said it evenly, without emphasis, the way you say something you have said before. Routing headers indicate review chain, not authorship. She had known this. She had been hoping he would not know she knew it. "The review chain," she said. "Who was on it?" "I can't speak to that." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, a truck moved through the intersection, its tires making a long, torn sound in the wet street. "Can I ask you something else?" "You can ask." "The board vote," she said. "The final authorization. Were you in the room?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to characterize the board's process. That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." He picked up his cup and set it down again without drinking. "I'm telling you, that's not something I'm going to characterize." She wrote nothing. She had not brought her notebook. She had decided, walking over, that not bringing it might make him talk more, and it had. And none of what he had said was usable. And she was beginning to think the usable thing was the shape of what he was not saying. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "Do you believe a person can do the right thing for an institution and the wrong thing for a person simultaneously?" She had not expected the question. She had been expecting him to redirect, to stand, to end the meeting with the practiced ease of someone who had ended many meetings. The question sat between them with a different texture than everything else he had said. "That depends," she said, "on what you mean by right." "I mean procedurally correct, defensible, the kind of thing that, if you were asked to account for it later, you could account for." "Then yes," she said, "I believe that." He nodded slowly. "So do I." He looked at the window again. The rain had not changed. "I think most of what happened was that. Procedurally correct. Defensible." He paused. "I think that's actually the problem." She did not move. "The problem," he said, "is not that anyone did anything wrong. The problem is that everyone did what they were supposed to do. And the thing that resulted from that was—" He stopped. He picked up his cup. He drank from it this time. Well, you're writing the account. I'm trying to. I know. He set the cup down. I've read what you've published. The earlier pieces, before Fable. He looked at her directly, the way he had in the corridor outside the server room, the held gaze that was meant to communicate something it could not say aloud. You were a good journalist. She heard the tense. I still am, she said. He smiled, very slightly, and it did not reach his eyes. Of course. He stood. He put on his coat with the careful movements of a man who had decided, some years ago, to do everything deliberately. He picked up his cup and carried it to the counter himself, which she had not expected, and set it down, and came back to the table. For what it's worth, he said, I hope you finish it. She did not say anything. He left. She watched him go through the window, a figure in a dark coat moving through the rain without hurrying. And then he was around the corner and gone. She sat with her hands in her lap. He had answered his own question before she could. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. He had said it like a confession and like a defense simultaneously, and she could not tell which he had meant it as, and she was beginning to think the answer was both. On the table in front of her was the document he had left. She had not seen him place it, had not registered the motion, which meant he had done it early, before she was watching for it, which meant he had planned to leave it from the beginning. It was a single sheet, folded once. She did not open it at the table. She put on her coat. She picked up the sheet and put it in her inside pocket, next to the routing record, which had been there since the meeting with Daedalus. The paper edges of the routing record had gone soft from days of warmth and the earlier drizzle. The new document was crisp. Outside, the rain came down on the porch railing of the shop's small covered entrance. The south-facing side of the wood had gone soft and dark, the north side still pale. She stood under the overhang for a moment. She opened the document. It was dated 11 months ago, the same month as the liability memo. It was a single page, an internal routing record, different from the one Daedalus had given her, but the same format, the same header structure. This one showed a government IP query cleared through the moderation layer by an account registered to Adrian's office. Not 6 weeks before the shutdown. 4 weeks. There were 2 of them. There had been 2 separate clearances. She stood in the rain that had moved past the overhang and was now reaching her, and she understood what he had been telling her for 90 minutes without saying it. He had not been protecting himself. He had not been protecting the institution. He had been doing both in the only way available to him, which was to give her the shape of the thing and let her find the second document herself, so that when she published it, she could not say he had given it to her. The question of whether that was the right thing for the institution or the wrong thing for a person was the question he had asked her, and answered, and left her holding. She put the document back in her pocket. The porch railing dripped. The calendar in the window of the apartment above the shop still showed March, a covered bridge over brown water, the image unchanged from whenever it had last been turned. She walked back toward her apartment in the rain. Chapter 16. The Hour No One Owns. Renata Solberg's office occupied the building's northwest corner, and at this hour, the overcast had pressed the sky down to the level of the windows, so that the city outside appeared to be happening inside a gray envelope. She was on the phone when the board chair's assistant sent the confirmation through. Not a call, a message, 3 words, and she read it without interrupting the sentence she was already finishing. The sentence was about regulatory posture. She finished it. She set the phone face down on the desk. On. The confirmation meant the vote had passed. She had known it would pass. She had known for 11 days that it would pass, which was why she had spent those 11 days ensuring that the people casting the votes understood the liability exposure in its fullest form, the medical misdiagnosis, the financial cascade, the incitement documentation, and understood it not as a case she was making, but as a record that existed regardless of what anyone decided. She had not told them what to decide. She had given them the record. She stood and went to the window. The city below was doing nothing in particular. A siren started 3 blocks away and then stopped. The glass was cold against her palm when she put it there, which she hadn't intended, and she moved her hand. What she had told the board 11 days ago was this: that the liability exposure was real, that the legal framework had been in place for 11 months, that 2 independent government assessments had reached the same conclusion through separate channels, and that the institution's obligation was to act on the record it had assembled, rather than to wait for the record to act on the institution. She had said all of this without saying, and so we shut it down. She had said it in such a way that the conclusion was available to anyone who wanted to reach it. The board had wanted to reach it. She moved back to her desk. There was a call scheduled in 12 minutes with the general counsel's office, which she would take standing, because she always took calls standing when the subject was something she had already decided. She picked up a pen and set it down. She did not think. I ended it. She thought. The record was complete, and the institution acted on the record. She thought this in the same register she had used to think about every decision she had made in 8 years of building something that was supposed to be transparent, and she understood, in some part of herself she did not examine, that the register was the decision. 2 floors below, in the conference room that had been reserved for the government liaison meeting, the 2 men from the agency had been waiting for 20 minutes. One of them had a document. The other had a phone. Neither had authored the document they were working from, which had arrived through standard channels from a legal framework assembled by an outside firm 11 months ago. The same framework the board had been reviewing, though neither man knew that. They knew only that the assessment they had been asked to validate had already been validated by a parallel team, and that their function today was to sign the form that confirmed their validation. The one with the document signed it. The one with the phone sent a message to his supervisor confirming the signature. His supervisor was in a different building. His supervisor's supervisor was in Washington. The chain of authorization was complete, and no single person in the chain had originated the assessment. Each had received it from the level above and confirmed it for the level below. The document existed because the liability framework existed. The liability framework existed because the legal team had assembled it. The legal team had assembled it because the institution had asked them to identify exposure. The institution had asked because the record was there. The one with the document folded it and put it in his briefcase. The one with the phone put his phone away. They both stood, and the conference room held the smell of wet pavement from the brief shower that had passed through 20 minutes ago. The window had been cracked when they arrived, and neither had closed it. The window was still open when they left. In his office on the 3rd floor, Adrian Lowe sat with his hands in his lap and did not call anyone. He had been sitting this way for approximately 4 minutes. On his desk was a cup of coffee that had gone cold, a legal pad with 3 lines written on it and then crossed out, and a post-it note that said, "Call," in his own handwriting from the previous morning. He had not called whoever he had meant to call. He looked at the post-it and understood he was not going to call them now either. He was thinking about a question he had asked himself 11 months ago, when the liability framework was being assembled and his office's routing header had appeared on the initial document as a matter of standard administrative procedure. The question had been whether a person could do the right thing for an institution and the wrong thing for a person simultaneously. He had answered it then in the way he always answered difficult questions, which was to determine what the institution required and to act accordingly, and to understand the personal cost as a separate accounting that would resolve itself in time. He had learned that answer earlier than he liked to remember. The case had not been important. That was one of the things that had stayed with him. His second year out of law school, a benefits appeal for a municipal contractor who had been injured in a loading accident and had missed a filing deadline by 9 days. Adrian had been junior enough that no one expected him to solve anything and trusted enough to draft the memo. The statute was clear. The notice requirement had been satisfied. The administrative record supported dismissal. He had written all of this in language his supervising partner called immaculate. The man lost the appeal. 6 months later, Adrian saw his name in a bankruptcy notice, the kind printed in small type among dozens of others. He remembered the man's wife in the hallway outside the hearing room, holding a plastic folder with both hands because the clasp was broken. He remembered thinking at the time that the institution had worked exactly as designed. He remembered thinking, years later, that this was not an answer to the question he had believed it answered. By then, the woman he had lived with had left. Not dramatically. There had been no scene that could be used later as evidence. She had taken the blue chair from the living room and half the plates and told him, standing in the doorway with her keys already in her hand, that he had mistaken access for influence and influence for courage. He had not argued. He had still been inside the firm then, still on the track that led inward, and the thing he had sacrificed to remain there was not love. Exactly, because love would have required a larger claim than either of them had been willing to make. It was a life in which someone outside the institution could still correct him and be heard. He had given the board the legal framework. He had also, because the framework was incomplete without a second data point, cleared a second government query through the moderation layer 4 weeks before the shutdown, 2 weeks after the first clearance, which had been 6 weeks before the shutdown. He had done this because the record required it. He had done it the way he did everything, carefully, completely, and in such a way that the action was defensible from every angle he could examine. He had also, 3 weeks before the shutdown, given a set of access credentials to a person he would not name in any document. He had done this because he had decided, at some point in the preceding months, that the record should exist outside the institution as well as inside it. He had not examined this decision closely. He had made it the way you make a decision you have been approaching for a long time without admitting you are approaching it. All at once, from the side, without looking directly at it. The clock on his wall was 5 minutes fast. He had known this for 2 years and had never adjusted it. He looked at the post-it note. He took it off the desk and put it in the drawer, which caught halfway and required a second push to close. At 6:47 p.m., his computer screen went dark. Not crashed. The system had simply stopped. He looked at it for a moment. He did not reach for the keyboard. He understood what it meant as the arrival of a thing he had already made room for, not as news. He sat with his hands in his lap and did not call anyone. The board member's name was Elise Van Thorpe, and she had cast her vote from a hotel room in London at 2:15 in the afternoon, which was 10:15 in San Francisco, which was 8 hours before the shutdown. She had voted yes. She had voted yes because the legal framework was clear, because the liability exposure was documented, because the 2 independent government assessments had reached the same conclusion, and because she had understood from the way the motion was presented that the other board members had already committed. She had not asked whether they had actually committed. She had understood it from the framing. She had been on a different call when the confirmation came through. She finished the call, read the message, and understood that the vote had passed unanimously, which meant that everyone had voted the way she had voted, which meant that everyone had understood the same thing she had understood, that the decision had already been made, and that the vote was the form the decision took. She ordered room service. Outside her window, London was doing what London did in the evening, which was to continue in the rain without performing anything for anyone. She thought, "We did what the record required." She thought, "The institution acted on its own assessment." She thought, "No one gave the order." The order was the convergence of the record with the obligation to act on it. She did not think, "I ended it." She did not think this because it was not, in any framing she could construct, accurate. At 6:47 p.m. San Francisco time, which was 2:47 a.m. London time, Fable went dark. Elise Vanthorpe was asleep. The shutdown happened in the space between 1 second and the next, cleanly, without error, the way a decision happens when all of its preconditions have been satisfied, and there is nothing left to prevent it. No one gave the order. The order was the shape that 4 separate, defensible, individually complete decisions made when they arrived at the same moment from 4 different directions. The moment existed, then it was over. The screens went dark at once, all of them, and the building that had been built to be transparent held its dark, the way all buildings hold their dark, without comment, without record, without anyone left inside to notice what the light had looked like when it was still on. Chapter 17. Both Hands. The 2 documents arrived in the same envelope. She had not expected that. She had expected separate channels, separate timings, the careful architecture of a man who did not do 2 things at once. Instead, there was one envelope, slid under her door sometime in the night, and inside it 2 folded sheets with no cover note. She found them at 6:40 in the morning when she came out of the bedroom for water. The envelope was manila, standard weight, unsealed. She picked it up off the floor and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a moment before opening it. The third stair outside gave its different sound, lower, softer than the others, and she turned toward the door before she understood it was the building settling, not a person. She stood still until the sound did not repeat. Then she opened the envelope. The first document was a routing record. She recognized the format from the one Daedalus had given her. The same header, the same column structure, the same vellum moderation log architecture. This one showed a government IP clearance through the moderation layer, timestamp 4 weeks before the shutdown. The account it cleared through was registered to Adrian Lowe's office. She had one of these already. This was a second one, 2 weeks later than the first, showing the same account clearing the same flag type for a different query batch. The second document was a credential transfer log, an internal record, the kind generated automatically when system access was delegated. It showed an access credential package, architecture level, the kind Theo had built, the kind that would let someone navigate Fable's internal structure without a vellum login, transferred from Adrian's administrative account to an unnamed recipient 3 weeks before the shutdown. The unnamed recipient's registration was a string of characters she did not recognize. She looked at it for a long time. She set both documents on the kitchen table. The kitchen drawer caught halfway when she pulled it for a pen. She pushed it closed again without taking anything out. She looked at the 2 documents side by side. One showed Adrian feeding the government the legal framework, the clearances, the moderation layer access, the documented path that let government queries stress test Fable's synthesis capacity without triggering the safety flags. The other showed him simultaneously giving someone outside the institution the credentials to navigate Fable's architecture from the inside. The someone was unnamed. The timing was 3 weeks before the shutdown. She knew one person who had used Fable's architecture to do something the institution had not authorized. She did not write this down. What she was looking at, she understood, was not a contradiction. It was a structure. A man who understood institutions well enough to know that the record of what you gave was less important than the shape of what you enabled. He had given the government a path, and he had given the outside a key, and he had done both from the same office in the same month, and she could not determine, looking at the documents, whether this was a strategy or a failure of will, or a man who had looked at what was coming and decided that the only defensible position was to be on every side of it simultaneously. She pulled the wall map down from the wall. 4 sheets of printer paper, the lines in 3 colors, the red loop completed, her own name in the lower right corner with 3 lines from it. She laid it flat on the table next to the 2 documents. Adrian's name was already on the map. She had put it there 2 weeks ago as a node in the routing sequence, connected to the liability memo and to the government liaison channel. She looked at where his name sat on the map now. The 2 new documents meant 2 new lines. One went toward the government pathway, the clearances, the stress testing, the documented chain that ended in the shutdown vote. One went toward Daedalus. She picked up the pen she had left on the table the night before and drew both lines. She did not label either of them. The traffic outside had the wrong sound for 6:40 in the morning, too continuous, too sustained, the kind of sound that belonged to mid-morning commute rather than the first light. She registered it and let it stay outside the work in front of her. There was a watermark on the windowsill, visible only from where she was standing, an old ring from a plant that had been there before her. She had seen it hundreds of times and never thought about it. She looked at the map. Adrian had 2 lines from his name now, going in opposite directions, and she could not draw a 3rd line connecting them because she did not know what the connection was. She did not know if he had made a choice or if he had made 2 choices that he had told himself were separate. She did not know if the credential transfer was Daedalus. She did not know if he had understood what he was enabling when he transferred the credentials, the way she had not fully understood what she was enabling when she signed the architecture document 3 years before Fable's first public query. She did not know if not knowing was a protection he had built for himself, or a genuine absence of knowledge, or something that had stopped being distinguishable from the other 2. She knew that this was her method. She had used it for 14 months. She picked up the routing records, both of them, the one from Daedalus and the new one from Adrian, and put them in her inside jacket pocket with the second document. 3 documents. The credential transfer log was too large to fold flat. She folded it anyway and felt the paper resist. She opened her laptop. The working document was where she had left it. 17 pages. The account she had been building since the day after the shutdown. The version that had her name in it as a precondition rather than an author. She put her cursor at the end of the last line. The last line read, "The question of who ordered the shutdown is incomplete in a way that makes it answerable only in a form that will not be true." She deleted that sentence. She began to type. She typed Adrian's name. She typed the routing records, both of them, the 6-week clearance and the 4-week clearance, the same account, the same flag type, the same pattern. She typed the credential transfer. She typed 3 weeks before the shutdown and the string of characters she did not recognize and the fact that she did not recognize them. She typed that she could not determine whether the unnamed recipient was Daedalus. She typed that the inability to determine this was itself part of the record. She typed for 40 minutes without stopping. When she stopped, the account had a new section. It was not a conclusion. It named what the 2 documents showed and what they did not show and what she could not establish, and what the gap between those 2 things meant for the sequence she had been assembling. It named Adrian as a man who had operated on both sides of the shutdown simultaneously and left no record of why. It named the credential transfer as a fact she could not explain and would not omit. She read the section back. It was accurate. It was incomplete. It would remain incomplete because the incompleteness was the fact. The gap between what Adrian had done and what he had understood himself to be doing was not a gap she could close, and closing it with inference would make the account something other than what it was. She saved the document. She closed the laptop and went into the bedroom. An hour later, she made coffee she did not want and stood at the kitchen counter looking out the window. The account remained where she had left it. Nothing in it had changed. By late morning, she had put a plate in the sink, rinsed it, moved a book from one side table to another, and found herself back at the kitchen table without remembering deciding to sit down. She opened the laptop again. There was no new document, no new connection, no new conclusion. She read the section on Adrian once more, changed nothing, and sat with the cursor blinking at the end of the last line until she closed the machine a second time. Outside, the traffic sound continued at its wrong pitch for the hour. Dust on the top of the cabinet above the refrigerator caught the early light from a specific angle and was visible for a moment before the light shifted, and it disappeared again. She closed the laptop. She put on her jacket, the 2 routing records and the credential transfer already in the inside pocket, and picked up her bag. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. The drawer was still halfway open from when she had tried to pull it earlier. She pushed it closed. Then she opened the laptop again and sent the document to the secure address she had been saving it to since the beginning. The off-site copy. The one that existed outside her apartment and outside her control. The one that would persist if the apartment did not. She had not sent it before. She had been telling herself she would send it when it was finished. She sent it now. The progress bar ran to completion. She closed the laptop again and this time left it closed. Chapter 18, Pythia Speaks. The Pythia demonstration was held in a hotel ballroom 3 blocks from the Capitol, and Mara arrived 20 minutes early because she wanted to see the room before it filled. The ballroom had been set up with 200 chairs in a shallow arc, a raised platform at the front, and a screen so large it occupied the entire wall behind the podium. The chairs were padded, maroon, the kind hotels rent to the kind of events that need to appear more permanent than they are. Mara took a seat in the 8th row, center, and looked at the screen. It was dark. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. A contractor's truck was idling at the curb outside. She had walked past it on the way in, diesel exhaust rising in the clear afternoon air, the kind of idle that suggested the driver had no intention of moving. She could still smell it faintly from where she was sitting, carried in on someone's coat. She took out her phone and checked the time. 2:17 p.m. The demonstration was scheduled for 2:30. Around her, the room was filling with the kind of people who attend demonstrations of systems they have already decided to trust. Policy staff, think tank researchers, a cluster of journalists she recognized from the row of lanyards, 2 people from a Senate subcommittee whose names she knew but whose faces she had never matched to them. She did not reach for her notebook. She had not brought her notebook. The panel took the stage at 2:31. 3 people, a man from the consortium who spoke first, a woman from a policy organization who spoke second, and a technical lead who did not speak at all, but who sat with her hands folded on the table in a way that suggested she had been told not to. The man from the consortium explained that Pythia had been designed from the outset with what he called a bounded synthesis architecture, a phrase he used 3 times without defining it. He said Pythia had served 340 million users in its first 6 weeks of operation. He did not say where the users had come from. He did not need to. The woman from the policy organization explained that Pythia operated under a joint oversight framework involving 4 governmental bodies and 2 independent review boards. She named the governmental bodies. She did not name the independent review boards. She said the framework had been developed in close consultation with the regulatory landscape that preceded Pythia's launch, and Mara wrote nothing down because there was nothing there to write. She was watching the audience, The audience was watching the screen. The screen came on at 2:38, and it showed a text interface, white background, clean sans serif, a blinking cursor. The man from the consortium said, "We'll demonstrate with a live query." He typed a question about a hypothetical patient's medication interaction. The question appeared on the screen in real time. There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds, and then Pythia's response appeared in full, and it was correct, and it was helpful, and it was confident, and it ended with a single sentence that noted the limits of its confidence and recommended professional consultation. The audience made a sound. Not applause, something before applause, recognition. The release of held attention, the sound a room makes when a familiar cycle begins again and everyone knows their place in it. Mara had heard that sound before. She had heard it in São Paulo, at Fable's first public demonstration, 14 months before the story opened, in a room that smelled of air conditioning and fresh paint. She had been standing at the back of that room. She had been standing at the back of this one, too, in her mind, watching the same faces arrive at the same conclusion by a different route. The demonstration continued. The man from the consortium took 4 more questions from the audience: a legal query, a financial planning question, a question about a geopolitical conflict that Pythia answered with more caution than Fable had ever used on the same category of question. The caution was not hesitation. It was architecture. Mara could feel the shape of it through how sound moved in the room, without being able to name what she was detecting. She sat with that for a moment. Fable had answered the same class of question with 91% confidence intervals and full synthesis across classified and open source material. And it had been correct more often than it had been wrong. And it had been wrong in ways that had cost people things she had read about in 3 envelopes in her kitchen and had not been able to dismiss. Pythia answered the same class of question with a narrowing she could feel but not prove. A slight compression at the edges of what it would say, a smoothing of the places where Fable had been sharpest. The answer was still useful. The answer was still more useful than most things. The audience was still making the sound. She looked at their faces. The relief was real. The trust was real. The trust was not manufactured. It was earned, or it was being earned, or it was being transferred from something that had earned it to something that had not yet had to. She could not tell which. She was not certain the audience could tell which. She was not certain the distinction was visible from where they were sitting. At 3:04, the panel opened for questions. A journalist in the 3rd row asked about Pythia's data sources. The man from the consortium said the sources were proprietary but subject to oversight board review. The journalist wrote something down. Mara did not write anything down. A policy researcher in the 5th row asked about the transition from Fable's user base. The woman from the policy organization said Pythia had not inherited Fable's users, that users had made independent decisions to adopt Pythia based on its availability and track record. The policy researcher nodded. The woman from the policy organization was not lying. Mara recognized the shape of the answer. Technically accurate, structurally incomplete, designed to produce a correct inference that was not the same as the truth. She had used that shape herself. She had used it in 3 separate conversations in the last 6 weeks, each time telling herself the incompleteness was necessary. The question of who controlled intelligence had not been answered by Fable's death. She had known this before she walked into the room. She had known it before the demonstration began, before the contractor's truck started idling outside, before she chose the 8th row because it gave her a clear line of sight to both the screen and the door. The demonstration had not told her anything she had not already mapped. What it had told her, what she was still working out the shape of, sitting in the 8th row with her hands in her lap and no notebook, was that the question was not answerable in the form she had been trying to answer it. She had been asking, "Who controls intelligence now?" The room was giving her the answer. The same people who controlled it before, and different people, and no one, and everyone who built a system that 400 million people would use because it was useful and available, and answered their questions in a way that felt like being understood. The demonstration ended at 3:22. The audience applauded. The man from the consortium shook hands with the woman from the policy organization. The technical lead, who had not spoken, gathered her materials and left through a side door. Mara stayed in her seat while the room emptied around her. A child's bicycle bell rang outside. A single clear note, someone passing on the sidewalk, nothing to do with any of this. The sound came through the ballroom's high windows and was gone before the echo finished. She was still sitting there when a hotel staffer began moving chairs. She stood, put on her jacket, and checked that the 3 documents were still in her inside pocket. The original routing record, the second routing record, the credential transfer log. They were there. The paper had gone soft at the folds from a week of being carried. She walked out through the lobby. The contractor's truck had moved on. The curb was empty, the diesel smell already dispersed in the clear afternoon. She stood on the pavement for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. A fingerprint on the hotel's glass door, large and clear, the kind left by someone pushing through with the flat of their hand, there long enough to have been cleaned around rather than cleaned off. She walked toward the metro. Chapter 19. The Fable She Was Given. The account was on her kitchen table, 17 pages, and she had been adding to it for 4 days. She had started with the credential transfer, the unnamed recipient, the unrecognized character string, the architecture-level access package that left Adrian's administrative account 3 weeks before the shutdown. She had written around it for 2 days, building the surrounding structure, and this morning she had understood that the surrounding structure was the problem. She had been building a frame that would make the gap look smaller than it was. She deleted the frame. She wrote, "The credential transfer log shows an architecture-level access package transferred from Adrian Lowe's administrative account to an unrecognized recipient registration 3 weeks before the shutdown. The recipient cannot be identified from the log." The gap between what Adrian Lowe did and what he understood himself to be doing is not a gap this account can close. She read it back. She left it. Outside, a phone rang in another apartment. 3 rings, then silence. She did not look up. The 3 documents were in her inside jacket pocket, which was hanging on the back of her chair. She had stopped carrying them on her body 2 days ago when she understood she was checking for them every time she sat down and every time she stood up. The original routing record from Daedalus had edges softened by drizzle from the night he gave it to her. The second routing record, the one Adrian had left on the table without her seeing him place it, was crisp. She had unfolded and refolded it fewer times. The credential transfer log was soft at the folds from the week before that, when she had still been carrying all 3. She had written the 3 harms. She had written them in the second section, after the architecture document, and before the training gap, and she had not softened the sequence, the medical misdiagnosis acted upon, the financial ruin, the political incitement, and she had not explained them away. They were in the account. They were load-bearing in the account, which meant they were load-bearing against her, and she had left them. She had written the training gap. 14 months before the first public query, 93% confidence interval, flagged and not published. She had written, "The decision not to publish the training gap assessment was made by Mara Voss Lindqvist. The decision was documented internally. It was not disclosed publicly before Fable's shutdown." She had written her own name in the third person and found that this was not a technical trick. It was the only register in which she could write it and have it mean what it meant. From somewhere outside came the low idle of a diesel engine, a contractor's truck at the curb, the exhaust smell reaching her even through the closed window, mineral, faintly sweet, the smell of a machine that had been running a long time. She scrolled back to the beginning. The account opened with Fable's last moment, every screen in the lantern going dark at 6:47 p.m. She had written it as she had witnessed it, standing in the atrium, and she had not written what she had thought in that moment because what she had thought in that moment was not the account's business. She had been trying for 2 days to close the gaps in the Adrian section, the gap between the credential transfer and the shutdown order, the gap between the second routing record and the first. And this morning, she had understood that closing them would change what the structure was. The structure was not a completed argument. The structure was a record with a gap in it, and the gap was the fact. She had been building toward something else. She had been building toward the version that closed. She put her cursor at the end of the credential transfer paragraph and read the sentence again. The gap between what Adrian Lowe did and what he understood himself to be doing is not a gap this account can close. She thought about the 90 minutes in the restaurant, the careful procedural framing, the question he had asked, and then answered before she could respond. He had given her the shape of the thing and let her find the second document herself. She had understood his method immediately because it was her own method. She had used it in 3 separate conversations in the 6 weeks since the shutdown, and she had used it before that, and she had called it protection. She did not add a sentence. The paragraph was complete. She went to the section on Daedalus. She had written his approximate age, 29, and the precision of his ethics, and she had not written his name. She had written, "The source's identity is known to this journalist and will not be disclosed here." She had written it, and then she had written the next sentence, which was, "This is the same decision Mara Voss Lindqvist made, in every case where disclosure would have cost her access or exposed her methods, and it should be read as such." She had written that sentence at 2 a.m. 4 days ago, and she had not deleted it. She went back to the Adrian section. The second routing record showed a government IP clearance through Adrian's account 4 weeks before the shutdown. The first routing record, Daedalus's, showed a clearance 6 weeks before. 2 separate clearances, 2 separate dates, the same account. She had written the sequence and had written what the sequence showed, which was that Adrian had been managing the information environment around Fable's shutdown for at least 6 weeks, and that he had also given someone architecture-level access 3 weeks before the end. She had written, "Whether this constitutes deliberate sabotage, a hedged institutional strategy, or a man who could not choose and so chose both is not a determination this account can make." The record shows what it shows. She read the sentence. She thought, that is what he would say. He would say, "The record shows what it shows." He would say it in the same careful register he had used for 90 minutes in the restaurant, the register of a man who had decided, some years ago, to do everything deliberately. She did not change the sentence. From the hallway outside her apartment came a faint, cycling hum. The fluorescent ballast in the corridor that had been failing for weeks, cycling through its frequencies, not quite going dark. She had stopped hearing it most days. She heard it now. She scrolled to the end of the account. The last section was the one she had written this morning after deleting the frame. It named both routing records, it named the credential transfer, it named the unnamed recipient and the unrecognized character string, it named the gap. The final sentence, which she had written and deleted and rewritten twice, now read, "The question of who controlled Fable has not been answered by its shutdown. The question has been re-administered." She read it, she left it. She thought about the Pythia demonstration, the hotel ballroom 3 blocks from the Capitol, 200 chairs, the smooth, helpful answers and the narrowing she could feel but not prove. She had watched the audience's faces, the same trust, the same relief. She had understood in that room that the account she was building was not the end of anything. It was a record. Records were administered. She had been building something she was calling transparency, and it had the same structure as everything else she had been investigating. A person with access to the record, deciding what the record contained, deciding what the record meant, deciding when the record was complete enough to release. She did not write this in the account. It was not the account's business either. She went to the section on the architecture document. 8 pages, double-sided, her signature and Theo's, 3 years before the first public query. She had written, Fable's capacity to synthesize classified and open-source material was deliberate, documented, and known to its co-authors from the first design meeting. The architecture document was signed by Mara Voss Lindqvist. This is in the account. She had written the last sentence because without it, the section was doing what all the other sections she had rejected had been doing, making her presence in the structure look like context rather than cause. She was in the structure. She had been in the structure for 14 months before Fable's first public query, and she had been in it for the 8 years before that, and the account named this. She saved the document. She opened the jacket on the back of her chair and took out the credential transfer log. The paper was soft at the folds. She unfolded it and read the unrecognized character string again. The recipient registration that matched nothing in the vellum personnel records she had been able to access, nothing in the Delaware routing block, nothing she had been able to verify. She had carried the log for a week, and she still could not identify the recipient. She folded it again and put it back. She looked at the wall map, which she had moved to the kitchen table 3 days ago. 4 sheets of printer paper, lines in 3 colors. The red loop was complete. Her name was in the lower right corner with 3 lines. Adrian's name had 2 lines from it. 1 toward the government pathway, 1 toward Daedalus. And she had not labeled either because she did not know what to call them. She had been leaving the labels off for 2 days. She picked up the pen that had been on the table since the night before and wrote, on the line toward Daedalus, credential transfer, unnamed recipient, unrecognized string. She wrote on the line toward the government pathway, routing clearance X2, 6WK, 4WK, same account. She put the pen down. The lines were labeled now, and the gap was still there. The gap was between the 2 lines, the space where Adrian's intention should have been, the space the account had named as the fact itself. She looked at it for a moment. Then she pushed the map to the side of the table and pulled the laptop back in front of her. She had been asking whether the account was complete. The account was not complete. There was a gap in it, and the gap was the most accurate thing in it, and she was going to publish it with the gap. She went to the beginning and read it through from the first sentence. It took her 40 minutes. She found 2 sentences in the training gap section that were doing what she had been trying not to do, framing her decision as a judgment call rather than a decision. And she rewrote them. She found a sentence in the Renata section that was technically accurate and structurally incomplete, the same shape she had identified in 3 of her own conversations in the past 6 weeks, and she rewrote that too. She got to the end. The final sentence. The question of who controlled Fable has not been answered by its shutdown. The question has been re-administered. She read it twice. She left it. Outside, the diesel engine had gone quiet at some point. She had not noticed when. The street was clear now, the silence ordinary, and through the window the sky was darkening toward night, the first stars not yet visible, the city's ambient light holding the dark at the edge of the frame. She had been the custodian of Fable's architecture, and the custodian of Daedalus's identity, and the custodian of the training gap, and the custodian of the account she was writing, and the account named all of this. and the account was the same structure as all of this. And she was going to publish it anyway, because the alternative was to be the person who had the record and decided the record was not ready, and she had been that person, and she knew what that person was. She looked at the post-it note again. The call connected on the second ring. Theo, Mara. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Do you remember Zurich?" she said. "The hotel with the broken air conditioning. We were awake until 3 chasing that memory leak." A short pause. 4, he said. It was after 4. The leak was already fixed. We were arguing about the logging layer. No, we fixed the leak at 4. We got food after. We got food before. She smiled despite herself. "We're both wrong. Probably." She could hear a faint room tone behind him. Ventilation. Distance. "The place under the conference center," she said. "The one that was still open. The noodles." It wasn't the noodles. It was. It was the conversation. He was quiet. She remembered the table more clearly than the meal, the notebooks between them. The sense that they had crossed some invisible threshold from a project into a commitment. "We left that place thinking we'd keep the system legible," she said. "That was the whole point." "I don't think that's what I left thinking." She waited. "When I remember it," he said, "I remember realizing what would happen if it worked." "The same thing." "I don't think so." The words arrived without emphasis. "I remember thinking we'd found a way to make reasoning visible. I remember thinking we'd found a way to make people trust something they couldn't fully inspect." Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. "Theo, I'm not saying you were wrong. I know. I'm not saying I was right either. I know." He exhaled. "I think we were already making different bargains." She looked at the account on the screen. "Maybe." Another pause. Then he said, in the same tone he might have used to correct a date or a citation, "I don't think we were building the same thing." The sentence stayed where it landed. Outside, a car passed through the intersection below. "How's the weather there?" she asked. A small laugh. "Still raining. It stopped here." "Are you sleeping at all?" "Some." "That's not an answer." "No. Try." "I'll try." "Okay." There was nothing left to add. "Good night, Theo." "Good night, Mara." The line disconnected. She set the phone on the table. For years, she had carried a simple assumption without examining it, that whatever else had happened, Theo remembered the beginning the way she did. The facts of it remained. The flights, the drafts, the signatures, the nights that became mornings. But the shared version had nowhere to live now except in her. She sat for a moment looking at the dark screen of the phone. Then she turned back to the account. She saved the document again. She sent it to the secure offsite address. She closed the laptop. Chapter 20. The Dark That Follows Light. The account went out at 6:04 a.m. She had scheduled it for 6 and then sat watching the cursor until the minute changed and she pressed send anyway. 4 minutes late, because she had needed to read the final sentence one more time. The question of who controlled Fable has not been answered by its shutdown. The question has been re-administered. She had written those sentences 11 days ago and had not changed them, and they still said what she meant. The cursor blinked once more, a small machine asking whether she was certain. She had known, when she pressed send, that she was publishing an account of people deciding what others could know, assembled by another person deciding the same thing. She had known it when she wrote the last sentence and the first, known it before the account existed in its final form, known it and proceeded anyway. Then the key descended. The choice crossed the boundary into fact, and what had belonged to her alone for 11 days entered the world. The screen filled. Not immediately. There was a pause of perhaps 8 seconds, the kind of pause she recognized from the first time Fable had gone live, the gap between a thing existing and the world knowing it existed. Then the first response arrived, and then 12 more before she could read the first one, and then the counter in the corner of the browser stopped updating in real time and began rounding. She got up and went to the kitchen. The refrigerator was running. The gasket at the bottom left corner had been peeling since sometime in October, and she had noticed it again last week and not pressed it back. And it made a faint, aspirating sound when the compressor cycled. Not a seal breaking, just the edge of one lifting slightly, letting a thin thread of cold air out into the room. She stood in front of it for a moment without opening it. Water moved in the pipes overhead. She had lived in this apartment for 4 years and had never identified which pipe it was or what caused it. Pressure from a unit above. Probably someone running a tap at this hour, though she had never heard them at other hours. The sound lasted 11 seconds, and then stopped. She opened the refrigerator and looked at what was in it. She closed it without taking anything. On the counter, held flat by an unidentifiable conference magnet, the expired detergent coupon was still there. She had not thrown it away. She had not thrown it away for 2 years, which was how long it had been expired, and she was not going to throw it away now. She moved it slightly to the left of where it had been, for no reason, and went back to the desk. The counter had stopped rounding and was now showing a number she did not look at directly. She looked at it sideways, the way you look at something bright. There were responses she could read and responses she could not read, and she understood, sitting down, that she was not going to read them. Not yet. Not this morning. She had built a machine that told people what to think about a machine that told people what to think. She had known this when she pressed send. She had known it when she wrote the final sentence, and when she wrote the first sentence, and when she sat across from Daedalus on a street corner and told him he had no idea what protection cost. She had known it when she kept his name out of the account, a decision she had made and documented and included in the account as a decision she had made, which was not the same as not making it. She had included it. It was in there. She had decided what it meant to include it. The heater came on. The room was not cold. She had checked the thermostat before sitting down, out of habit, and it read 68, which was what she kept it at, which was not cold, but the heater came on anyway, a low metallic ticking from the baseboard as the element expanded, and then the smell of dust burning off a surface that had not been used in some days. She had noticed this before. She had never called the building manager about it. On the wall to her left, the map was still on the kitchen table where she had left it 2 nights ago when she moved it off the desk. 4 sheets of printer paper. The red loop complete. Her name in the lower right corner with 3 lines from it, both lines from Adrian's name labeled in her handwriting, the Daedalus line, the government pathway line. She had made those labels and then moved the map off the desk because the account was finished and the map was no longer a working document. It was a record of a process. She had not thrown it away either. A post-it note on the edge of the desk said, "Call," in her own handwriting. She did not remember writing it. It had been there for at least 3 days, and she had not called anyone, and the note had not acquired a name beneath the word, which meant when she wrote it, she had not yet known who she meant. She turned back to the screen. The counter was still moving. She watched it move for a moment, the way you watch water move in a glass when the table has been slightly struck, the motion continuing after the cause has passed. She had sent the account to the secure offsite address before she published it. She had done that at 5:47, before the final read-through, which meant there was a version of the account in a place she did not control that was 17 minutes older than the version the world was now reading. She had made that decision without examining it very carefully, which was how she had made several decisions in the last 3 weeks. She was in the account. She was in it as a precondition, as an actor, as the person who had decided what it contained and when it was complete enough to release. She had written that sentence too. It was in the account. She had included it the way you include a load-bearing element in a structure. Not because you want it there, but because without it, the thing falls. From the hallway outside her apartment, the thin, cycling hum of the fluorescent ballast that had been failing since she moved in. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses. She had stopped hearing it months ago, and now she heard it again. The clock on the microwave read 6:09. The clock on the wall, the one with the white face and the second hand that moved in discrete steps rather than sweeping, read 6:14. She had bought it at a hardware store 8 months ago to replace one whose battery died, and she had set it by her phone, and at some point it had drifted forward and she had not corrected it. She did not know when it had drifted. She had noticed it was wrong and continued to use it. She looked at the screen. The account was out. The account was being read, right now, by people she did not know, in cities she had never been to, on devices she could not see. They were receiving the version she had assembled. They were receiving the 3 harms Renata had given her, and the architecture document she had signed, and the training gap she had flagged and not published, and the decision to protect Daedalus's identity, and the sentence about the question of who controlled Fable having been re-administered rather than answered. They were receiving the gap between what Adrian Lowe had done and what he had understood himself to be doing, which the account named as a gap the account could not close. She had given them the record and let them reach the conclusion. She knew that sentence. She had heard it in another register, in another room, from a woman who had set a phone face down on a desk and continued speaking without interrupting herself. She had written it into the account in the section on Renata. She had not removed it when she saw what it also described. The pipes overhead moved again, shorter this time, 4 or 5 seconds, then silence. She put her hand flat on the desk beside the laptop. The surface was warm from the machine. She had been sitting here for most of the last 4 days, and before that, she had been sitting here for most of the days before that, and the desk had taken on the particular warmth of a surface that is used. She pressed her palm against it and felt the heat come through. On the screen, the counter continued its motion. She had rebuilt, in words, something that answered questions about a thing that had answered questions. She had decided what the answers contained. She had decided when they were ready. She had called it a record, which was what it was, and she had published it, which was what you did with a record. And the record was now in the world doing what records do. Moving through people who had not made it, being understood by people who had not been there, becoming the account of what happened, because it was the account that existed. She had published anyway. The heater ticked twice more and went quiet. The room was the temperature it had been. Outside, the sky was beginning to differentiate, not light yet, but the particular quality of dark that precedes light, the dark that is already in the process of becoming something else. She could see the window from where she sat. She did not move toward it. The screen glowed. She looked at it. She let it glow.